Those folks who support our program, who help essentially sponsor us on YouTube and on Patreon, have access to content, special content that is generally not available on YouTube or anyplace else. In exchange for supporting us at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, you get the whole 3-hour show, a video podcast that's not available to the general public, that you can watch anytime you want for every single show every day, plus special content that is not available anywhere else. The rant this week: 200,000 Americans have died from overdoses involving prescription opioids since 1996. So the question, what do we do with a company and the individuals who own that company and run that company that has been directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 Americans? What do we do? We've got a serious problem with an out-of-control pharmaceutical industry in the United States, and we need and product liability in general. We need to do something about it. In the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, our book is by Frantz Fanon, and it's The Wretched of the Earth. This is from the chapter on national culture on page 145. It sort of reads like Thomas Paine, actually. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. In the underdeveloped countries, preceding generations have simultaneously resisted the insidious agenda of colonialism and paved the way for the emergence of the current struggles. Now that we are in the heat of combat, we must shed the habit of decrying the efforts of our forefathers or feigning incomprehension at their silence or passiveness. They fought as best they could with the weapons they possessed at the time, and if their struggle did not reverberate throughout the international arena, the reason should be attributed not so much to a lack of heroism, but to a fundamentally different international situation. More than one colonized subject had to say, "We've had enough." More than one tribe had to rebel. More than one peasant revolt had to be quelled. More than one demonstration had to be repressed for us to stand firm, certain of our victory. For those of us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, and every attack aborted or drowned in blood. In this chapter, we'll analyze the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim to a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with this issue of legitimacy. Political parties are concerned solely with daily reality, and it is in the name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy which influences the present and future of men and women, that they make their call to action. The political party may very well speak of the nation in emotional terms, but it is primarily interested in getting the people who are listening to understand that they must join in the struggle if they quite simply want to exist. We now know that in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism attempts to diffuse nationalist demands by manipulating economic doctrine. At the first sign of a dispute, colonialism feigns comprehension by acknowledging with ostentatious humility that the territory is suffering from serious underdevelopment that requires major social and economic reforms. And it is true that certain spectacular measures, such as the opening of work sites for the unemployed here and there, delay the formation of a national consciousness by a few years. But sooner or later, colonialism realizes it is incapable of achieving a program of socioeconomic reforms that would satisfy the aspirations of the colonized masses. Even when it comes to filling their bellies, colonialism proves to be inherently powerless. The colonial state very quickly discovers that any attempt to disarm the national parties at a purely economic level would be tantamount to practicing in the colonies what it did not want to do in its own territory. And it is no coincidence that today the doctrine of Cartierism is on the rise just about everywhere. Cartier's bitter disillusionment with France's stubborn determination to retain ties with people it will have to feed, whereas so many French citizens are in dire straits, reflects colonialism's inability to transform itself into a nonpartisan aid program. Hence, once again, no need to waste time repeating, better to go hungry with dignity than to eat one's fill in slavery. On the contrary, we must persuade ourselves that colonialism is incapable of procuring for colonized people the material conditions likely to make them forget their quest for dignity. Once colonialism is understood where its social reform tactics would lead it, back come the old reflexes of adding police reinforcements, dispatching troops, and establishing a regime of terror better suited to its interests and its psychology. Within the political parties, or rather parallel to them, we find the cultured class of colonized intellectuals. The recognition of a national culture and its right to exist represent their favorite stomping ground. Whereas the politicians integrate their action in the present, the intellectuals place themselves in the context of history. Faced with the colonized intellectuals' debunking of the colonists' theory of a pre-colonial barbarism, colonialism's response is mute. It is especially mute since the ideas put forward by the young colonized intelligentsia are widely accepted by metropolitan specialists. It is in fact now commonly recognized that for several decades, numerous European researchers have widely rehabilitated African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilizations. Some have been surprised by the passion invested by the colonized intellectuals in their defense of a national culture. But those who consider this passion exaggerated are strangely apt to forget that their psyches and their egos are conveniently safeguarded by the French or German culture, whose worth has been proven and which has gone unchallenged. I concede the fact that the actual existence of an Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasant. I concede that whatever proof there is of the once mighty Songhai civilization does not change the fact that the Songhais today are undernourished, illiterate, abandoned to the skies and water, with a blank mind and glazed eyes. But as we have said on several occasions, this passionate quest for a national culture prior to the colonial era can be justified by the colonized intellectuals' shared interest in stepping back and taking a hard look at the Western culture in which they risk becoming ensnared. Fully aware that they're in the process of losing themselves and consequently of being lost to their people, these men work away with raging heart and furious mind to renew contact with their people's oldest inner essence, the furthest removed from colonial times. Let us delve deeper. Perhaps this passion and this rage are nurtured, or at least guided, by the secret hope of discovering beyond the pleasant wretchedness, beyond the self-hatred, something that redeems us.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And top of the morning to you, or afternoon, or whatever it may be, wherever you are. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Foxconn, and first hour of our program. We are live from Portland, Oregon today. The situation in Wisconsin, this is absolutely A, fascinating, and B, predictable, right? I mean, back when Scott Walker was saying, yeah, let's give $1 billion to Foxconn, or hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks. And in the actual deal that so Foxconn, of course, is the Chinese company that makes parts for iPhones. And they wanted to open a factory in the United States so that they could say, oh yeah, some of our stuff is made in the USA. Because, you know, Apple's getting pressure about making their stuff overseas. So, you know, if they're one of their suppliers, could make it in the US. And so Foxconn comes to Scott Walker and says, you know, give us a fortune, give us you know, $1 billion or hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll build a factory here and we'll employ 13,000 people. Which is like $300,000 per job in state money that we're giving Foxconn to create jobs that'll pay, you know, what, maybe $40,000 a year? And but still, they're, quote, manufacturing jobs. These are, quote, good jobs. And now Foxconn is saying, you know, the agreement actually doesn't say that we have to create 13,000 jobs. That was just the news release that Donald Trump and Scott Walker quoted. But the agreement says that you have to pay us you have to give us all these tax breaks and give us all this money for decades, even if we don't build a factory. So instead, we're just going to build a little R&D unit. And we're just going to hire some people, maybe as many as 1,000, maybe not. So the question, here we have another example. And this is, you know, certainly not the first. This has been going on in a huge way since the 1980s. Reagan actually promoted this kind of stuff. He thought competition among the states is a good thing. And so companies started playing this blackmail game, basically. I mean, probably the most famous example recently is Boeing. And this was a couple of years ago where Boeing was going, well, you know, we're here in Seattle, but, you know, we've got a large footprint in Seattle. We'd like to reach out and have a large footprint in a few other states where we can have some power over a few other senators and members of Congress, and we can have some national diversity. So, you know, when we're trying to get another big defense contract, we'll have more support, or whatever. I mean, whatever their reasons may have been. And so they said, who's going to give us the most money? And you had all these different cities go, oh, we'll give you 10 years of tax abatements. We'll give you 5 years. We'll give you 20 years. We'll give you $1 billion. We'll give you land for free. We'll give you, this is a scam. And it's a scam or a con that big corporations, whether they're Chinese or American, big corporations have been running on American communities in a big way since the 1980s. And I think we need to put a stop to it. Now, I have an idea that I borrowed from Bernie Sanders years ago on how to stop this, and that is that any state in which the state, county, or municipal governments, in which any government in that state has offered tax breaks to a corporation to open a location in that state, any state that does that loses their federal highway funds. Very straightforward stuff. Now, why would you do this? Because prior to Reaganism, prior to the 1980s, the way that states used to compete with each other for business, the way that municipalities and counties and even states would go to big companies and say, you really should build your factory here, was based on infrastructure. It was real simple. Massachusetts would say, we've got MIT, we've got Harvard, we've got the Metro, we've got a good public transportation system, we've got a great public education system. You can have good, well-paid, you can have well-trained, very, very smart people working for you, and all you have to do is relocate yourself to Massachusetts. And companies did. And in California, hey, we've got a free public university system. College is free in California. This was all prior to Reagan becoming governor. He blew that up in the mid-70s. But, prior to that, California would say, well, actually, even through the 80s, because even when they made the colleges in California, when Reagan was governor and then as president, even though college in California became, kind of starting to get kind of expensive, it was still cheaper than pretty much anywhere else in the country. I mean, they had this entire statewide university system. And so California would say to companies, relocate here in California, we've got an educated workforce. Portland, Oregon would say to companies, we have one of the most planned metropolitan areas in the United States. Pretty much everywhere in Portland, you can walk within a mile, you can walk to all your basic necessities. You can walk to a store where you can buy toilet paper or where you can buy groceries or, fill in the blanks. We've got a very livable city. There is more green in Portland relative to non-green space than in any other city in the United States and most cities in the world. And it caused a lot of companies to say, hey, let's build in Portland. But then when Reagan came along and said, oh, no, it's, and this was the beginning, by the way, of Walmart expanding out and abandoning Sam Walton's claim that it's 100% made in America. That used to be the Walmart slogan or sub-slogan. Abandoning that and then starting this predatory practice of moving into areas where there was no, large stores. There was a lot of vital, active local business moving into these communities and eating alive the local businesses. And since the 80s, they started out doing that without any support, without any, tax abatements and things like that. Now they've got this thing fine-tuned down to the point where local communities are even helping them, prevent unions. But now when a Walmart opens, they get free land, they get tax cuts, they get tax abatements, they get, local support. Every business that opens, it seems, as long as it's a giant corporation. If it's a small company, nah. Maybe small companies, there was talk back 20, 30 years ago about, getting small companies together. Let's all band together and ask for tax breaks. It never worked. The towns, the municipality, they know that you're stuck here. You got a small company. But it used to be that cities competed with each other based on their infrastructure, their livability, the quality of life, the quality of workers, the quality of infrastructure. And what that did prior to the 1980s, when communities competed with each other based on infrastructure, was it provided an incentive for all these communities to get richer, to get wealthier, because their infrastructure is part of their wealth. A city that has a good mass transit system, a city that has good high-speed broadband. This is what Chattanooga is doing. You know, a city-owned Wi-Fi system that is literally the fastest in the country and the cheapest in the country, because just like with healthcare, you don't have a giant corporation like Comcast just sucking all the money off the top and not upgrading their equipment and stuff, because it's not as profitable. So that's, you know, my idea of a way to do this. I'm curious what you think. Meanwhile, or you know, if you have any other suggestions. Meanwhile, I would add that I think that it's very much time for us to say, you know, we've got to restore incentives in the United States, not just to build, not just to manufacture things in this country, but to hire Americans to do that. You know, Foxconn's whole business model is cheap labor. And we've known that all along. It's a Chinese company. What made anybody think that they were going to actually hire people at a high wage in the United States? So how do you do this? This is the question that the people who started this country faced. George Washington, when he was, you know, when Charles Thompson, who was the Secretary of the Continental Congress, you know, rode up to Washington's house on April 14th, 1789 and said, "Okay, sir, you're president." And Washington was like, "Okay, two things we need to do. Number one, I need to go say goodbye to my mother because I'm never going to see her alive again," which was true. She was in her 80s and dying. And then he said, "And I also want to be inaugurated in a suit of clothing made in the United States," which up until then had been illegal, up until the end of the Revolution, because we were operating under British colonial law. And the British said, "No, you may not manufacture clothing in the United States. You have to buy it from England. You have to support our workers." But on April 28, 1873, a guy named Daniel Hinsdale started a little made-in-America clothing store in Hartford, Connecticut. And George Washington knew about it. And he said, "Go to Hinsdale, get me a suit made in America." So Charles Thompson took his measurements and continued his horseback ride to Connecticut. And when he came back to New York, which is where Washington was sworn in, George Washington took his oath of office wearing a brown suit. Hinsdale didn't have any American-made black clothing, wearing a brown suit that was made in America. So then Washington turned to Hamilton and said, "Now, how do we do this? How can we build manufacturing in this country?" And Hamilton said, "Tariffs." It's very straightforward. He came out with this 11-point plan to rebuild America, or to build America. Item number one, protecting duties, or duties on those foreign articles which are the rivals of domestic ones. Number two, prohibition of rival articles or duties equivalent to prohibitions. Again, tariffs. Number three, prohibitions on the exportation of material manufacturers. In other words, stop sending our raw materials overseas. Stop shipping cotton to England and start using it here. Put an export tariff on it. Number four, pecuniary bounties. There are certain things that we definitely want to manufacture here. For example, cannons, or, you know, roads, or whatever. So you put you don't export roads. So we're going to actually give people an incentive to manufacture these things. Premiums. Same thing, the exemption of raw material of manufactured from duty. If you want to import raw materials to make manufactured goods, no tariffs. Drawbacks on the duties which are imposed when materials, you know, these are all variations on the same thing. And this is what built America. Tariffs paid for 100% of our government, from the George Washington administration to the Civil War. It paid for 2/3 of our government from the Civil War to World War II. Now it pays for virtually nothing. So another question, with Donald Trump promoting tariffs, how do the Democrats reclaim their historic support for protectionist trade policies? Which, I'm an advocate of. How do we do it?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our number 202-808-9925, and we'll be back right after this. And welcome back. This is absolutely amazing. Oh, one of the things that this makes me so happy. Yesterday I went off on this long rant about property taxes and how if as long as you have property tax, nobody actually owns their land, number one. And number two, that a property tax is a wealth tax. And it is, so we do have a wealth tax in the United States. Howard Schultz says, "Oh, wealth tax? Are you kidding? It's crazy." And what I was saying is, no, in fact, we do have a wealth tax. It's called a property tax, and it's mostly paid by the middle class. Because if you own a house, and in 25 states, if you own a car, every year you pay a tax based on the value of it. That's a tax on wealth. And then after we got off the air yesterday, Trollbuster99 over on Democratic Underground posted a post saying kind of the same thing. Every year I have to pay 2% in property tax. It's not an income tax, it's a property tax, and property is a form of static wealth. Spot on. I don't know if this is a case of great minds think alike or if he heard my rant, but I'm so pleased that it's getting out there. This is why I do this. I want to get the message out. So that post, it's over the top of DU right now. It's titled "Note to Bloomberg." Like a lot of people, I own a house, and every year I have to pay. Retweet it. Post it on Facebook. I mean, this guy really boiled it down really, really well. And in fact added to it. In fact, he said, and you call us socialist? You want to see true capitalism, raw capitalism, naked capitalism, unregulated capitalism? Look at Russia. Wow. So, tip of the hat to you. Meanwhile, Howard Schultz is saying that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is an extreme leftist and that he is in the center, that he represents the center. And this was so amazing. Nick Hanauer, who's been a guest on this program a number of times. Nick Hanauer is a member of the Democratic Alliance, or the Democracy Alliance. And he's a multimillionaire. I'm not sure if he's quite a billionaire, but he's worth a hell of a lot of money. And he started this thing called Patriotic Millionaires. And he knows Howard Schultz. Billionaires know each other. And so on MSNBC, they asked him, what do you think about what Howard Schultz is saying? And he said, and I quote, "What Howard Schultz represents, the centrism he represents, is trickle-down economics, tax cuts for rich people, deregulation for powerful people, wage suppression and benefit cuts for everyone else without the overt racism. He is not the centrist. AOC is the centrist." And he says, I think one of her advantages, this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of her advantages is that she's young enough not to be captured by the neoliberal lies that have framed so much of our politics. By the way, at both the Democratic and Republican parties, or the Republican and Democratic parties. And he is so right. I mean, yesterday we saw legislation introduced to increase Social Security. Consider just 10 years ago, Barack Obama was considering cutting Social Security. There has been a complete change in terms of conventional wisdom inside the Democratic Party, and I think that we have all played a part in this. We have all played a role in this. So anyhow, it's Thursday here on the Thom Hartmann Program. If there are topics beyond how do we stop Foxcons and their scams, feel free to give us a shout. 202-808-9925, whatever you'd like to talk about. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. This is Nick Hanauer, the Patriotic Millionaires. He's a very, very wealthy guy, and he's calling out Howard Schultz, saying that the centrism he represents is trickle-down economics, tax cuts for rich people, deregulation for powerful people, wage suppression and benefit cuts for everyone else, without the overt racism. All right, Howard Schultz is Donald Trump without the racism. Spot on. Absolutely spot on. Now, and I said, basically, how do you think we can best stop this insanity? I think that we do it by blocking the highway funds, federal highway funds, because when you turn off the federal highway funds to a state, that state gets crippled. Meanwhile, And so, do you have any suggestions on that? Or frankly, other thoughts or observations? Right now, Donald Trump is he's tweeting, let's just call it a wall. Come on, it's a wall. And you've got the Democrats and Republicans getting together trying to come up with a compromise, in quotes. And Trump is like, no compromise, it's a wall. And I think, Nancy Pelosi is saying, no, we're not going to fund a wall. We would be glad to fund border security. We need more guards down there. We need more judges. And in the second hour of the program, I'm going to do a real deep dive into this whole thing here of who are we imprisoning, how, and why. There's just some shocking statistics on this. But also, we've got, now, Gail Collins is asking the question over in the New York Times, who is the worst cabinet member in the Trump cabinet? And I open the phones to you with your opinion on this, too. So we got Kirstjen Nielsen, right, who lied about the policy of separating children from their families. This is Austin Evers of the watchdog group American Oversight says, Nielsen has enthusiastically generated false evidence to justify the president's xenophobic immigration policies, zealously executed those policies in ways that have shocked the world, and then brazenly lied about both. So is she the worst? Or would it be Betsy DeVos, who has basically spent her time, this is Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, says DeVos basically spent her time in that office working for everyone but the kids. Or is it Rick Perry? We just discovered that Rick Perry authorized the transportation of 1,000 pounds of plutonium across the country to Nevada. 1,000 pounds. 1 ounce of plutonium, if it was evenly distributed over the entire Earth, would kill every human being. 1 ounce. This is 1,000 pounds. Plutonium is the most deadly substance known to man. If you get plutonium in your lungs, it always kills you. So is it Rick Perry? Is it Andrew Wheeler, the guy who's running the EPA? He's a coal industry lobbyist. I mean, he's not going to go to the Ritz-Carlton. He's not going to send his employees to the Ritz-Carlton to get the toiletries, but, like Pruitt did. But this guy is like turning the country over to the coal industry. Or is it the Interior Secretary, David Bernhardt? He's a former oil industry lobbyist. Or is it Alex Azar, the guy who's running Health and Human Services, a former drug company lobbyist? Or is it Mike Pompeo, who's running the State Department? He's calling it, he's the Department of Swagger. Or is it Steve Mnuchin, who's apparently in debt to Russian oligarchs and thus cut the sanctions to them? Or is it Ben Carson, the housing secretary? I vote for Kirstjen Nielsen. But I think that the guys running EPA and Interior are also pretty awful. So what do we do about this stuff? We've got just a complete perversion of democracy here in the United States. We've got the capture of our political class by big corporations. You've got communities like Wisconsin being essentially raped by people like Scott Walker. How do we stop this? What do we do here?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And your picks for worst cabinet secretary after this. It's 27 minutes and a half past the hour. Today we're reading from the Constitution Today by Akil Reed Amar. This is from it's a collection of essays. This is from his essays on the judiciary. This was originally published on Find Law in 2002. It's titled More on Unfree Speech. The Supreme Court prohibits network television cameras and radio microphones from its public oral arguments. Transcripts of the back and forth between attorneys and the justices are not posted on the court's website until weeks have passed and the public's interest has waned. Members of the public may not even take notes in the gallery about what is being said in open court. Meanwhile, in its opinions, the court trumpets the importance of free speech and a free press. On the topic of free expression, why doesn't the Supreme Court practice what it preaches? That was the question Steve Calabrese and I recently posed in an op-ed in the New York Times, marking the opening of the Supreme Court's term earlier this month. Here I'll expand on the court's reluctance to welcome the First Amendment into its own courtroom. The First Amendment is the darling of the current court. Though sharply divided on many other issues, justices across the spectrum agree that free expression rights should be construed broadly. But the court's love affair with that First Amendment is a relatively modern development. Less than a decade after the adoption of the Bill of Rights, circuit-riding justices enthusiastically enforced a 1798 sedition law that made it a federal offense to criticize the president. Early in the 20th century, the court upheld punishment of a newspaper publisher for editorializing against state judges. During World War I, the justices sent Eugene Debs, a notable presidential candidate, to prison for peacefully criticizing the government. Indeed, before 1925, the court had never, not once, used free expression principles to invalidate government censorship, even as it routinely construed property rights broadly to invalidate economic regulation. Today's justices have repudiated this regressive legacy, but the residue of the early court's indifference to free expression remains visible in the court building itself, as the aforementioned rules and practices indicate. Perhaps these court rules and practices do not literally abridge freedom of speech or of the press, but if not, they sure come close. After all, the apparent purpose of these rules is precisely to limit free expression and free thought. Consider the rule against note-taking. A person in the courtroom can clean his wallet, or twiddle his thumbs, or tug his earlobe, or engage in countless other mindless activities, but is prohibited from engaging in the cognitive and expressive activity of writing down what he hears the justices saying, along with his own comments or questions or criticisms. Consider also the rule against the media's cameras. The court's rules do not bar security cameras in the courtroom, and such cameras may well be in the room for all we know. What the justices are banning is thus not cameras per se, but network television cameras, cameras that might broadcast information about the court to the American public. The harms that these rules seek to prevent are harms that pivot on the acts of thought and expression themselves. And these are the very sorts of harms the government typically may not seek to prevent under the Supreme Court's standard First Amendment case law. To put the point another way, no Supreme Court rule bars carrying a pencil into the courtroom or wearing a chopstick in one's hairdo. The ban is not based on security concerns, but is rather directly aimed at expressive activity per se, using one's pencil to take notes. More generally, one of the core purposes of the First Amendment is to protect a robust and timely public discourse about government officials and government decision-making, including, of course, judicial officials and judicial officials' decisions. But that discourse is precisely what is dampened by the court's own rule about its own building. This is especially so because the day of oral argument is one of the 2 days, the other being when the final Supreme Court decision is announced, that the American public and the American media are most likely to focus on a given legal case. If discourse that day is dampened, the public has lost a unique and irreplaceable occasion for democratic discussion and deliberation. When it comes to other government arenas, post offices, airports, school grounds, and so on, the court has typically insisted that such forums allow as much speech as is functionally compatible with the basic purpose of the arena. Yet in its own building, the court represses expressive activity without any strong showing of incompatibility or disruption. There is a word for this, and it is spelled hypocrisy, hypocrisy. The court's transcript policies are also unfree in another sense. In the days after oral argument, the transcripts are anything but free. The court gives a temporary monopoly to a private company, which in turn charges high fees for transcripts. The court would never, nowadays at least, give a private company a monopoly over its written opinions. Why should its oral arguments be treated any differently? There's nothing secret or confidential about oral arguments. Unlike judicial conferences where justices deliberate privately among themselves, oral arguments take place in open court. They are public events conducted by public servants with public money. The public deserves full access. To recast the point in the language of federalism, Americans outside the Beltway deserve electronic access comparable to the ability of those who live in Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland to attend arguments in person. If television cameras are not acceptable, at a minimum, the arguments should be carried live on public radio, as happened in December 2000 for Bush v. Gore, and transcripts should be freely available immediately. The book is The Constitution Today by Akil Reed Amar.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So Trump is rage tweeting this morning about his wall. You know, Paul said I could have a wall, and Nancy won't give me a wall, but I'm going to send troops down there, but we are already building the wall, but no, we're not building the wall, but I want, you know, it is 2-year-old tantrum time in the White House. Can you imagine working at the White House and having, you know, your boss just go on these rage tweets at 6 a.m., and then you come into work at 9 or 10 and you get just, oh, geez, I've got to clean up the mess. It's like, you know, elephant poop all over, right? I mean, you're like the guy who follows the elephant with a little tiny shovel in the bucket. That's got to be a tough job. Jim in Poway, California. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind?
Yeah,
today?
Tom, how you doing today?
Good.
Just a thought to pick your brain. We have everything in place right now for a national sales tax. There'd have to be a caveat for low-income people, but put it across the board. People that would want to save money could do that, and I think it would be something like under 3%. Is that reasonable, or am I way out in left field?
I'm not sure that the 13th Amendment authorizes a national sales tax on the one hand. On the other hand, if it was done as a value-added tax, it would be, you know, inserting the tax into commerce, which Congress has the power to regulate. I'm just not sure. I'd have to ask somebody who really understood the tax and the Constitution. But I think that a VAT tax, which is sort of a national sales tax, is the smartest way to do it, Jim, because you can use a VAT tax to be a functional reverse tariff. Are you familiar with a VAT tax? You know what a value-added tax is?
Yeah, I do, actually.
Yeah, okay. So, let me just really quickly explain for our listeners who may not be familiar with it. This is how it works in Germany, for example. If you're going to build a Mercedes in Germany, when you buy the iron, when the iron ore is turned into iron, there's a small tax because it's increased in value. When the iron is turned into steel, there's a small tax because it's increased in value. When the steel is turned into flat steel or rolled steel, there's a slight tax because it's increased in value. When that's turned into a car door, there's a slight increase or a slight tax because that's increased. And each stage, different companies are paying these taxes, each stage of the manufacturing process, until finally you've got the finished car. And that tax in aggregate adds up to around 17% of the value of the car. And so what Germany does is they say to American car buyers, now this value-added tax is only supposed to be paid by German citizens. So if you're an American in the United States buying a German car, we're going to discount the price of that car by 17%. On the other hand, if somebody in Germany wants to buy a Chevy made in the United States, then we're going to hit that with the 17% value-added tax when it gets imported. So you've got a 34%, if I'm doing my math right, effective tariff on German cars or on American cars. That's the difference between the two. So, and you know, Germany does this, basically every country in Europe does this, Japan does this, China does this, Taiwan does this, South Korea does this, all these countries do this. We're basically the only developed and industrialized country that doesn't do this. And like I said, it's sort of like a national sales tax. So that, Jim, makes sense?
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable to me.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's a way of accomplishing a national industrial policy at the same.
It would be fair across the board. I think.
Right, at the same time that you're raising revenues. Jim, thanks for the call.
Good.
Well said. George in Long Beach, California, listening on KPFK. Hey, George, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Hey, I got full works of Thomas Paine not too long ago, and I've yet to start it. But anyhow,
start with agrarian justice.
Okay, I'll take note of that. Thank you. So I was thinking, you know, I'm a union guy, and we have these tendencies to overthink things, I think, in the larger, you know, the macroeconomic sense. On the ground, I'm a Teamster driver, and on the ground, when I want to affect change through my local, we have really an option to work or not to work under contract or not even out of contract sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You're talking strikes.
Pressure. Right. You can call it what strike has the connotations of, you know, it has some negative connotations. I'm just trying to bring up, as a general sense, if you don't have a contract and you don't want to go to work, you're not going to work. So collectively, if we had a regional process, you know, through some sort of organizational system outside of a union, you can affect radical economic change, and in turn, the sociological problems that are stacked on top of that, which you're well familiar with, they seemingly kind of go away if everybody is paid a living wage.
Yeah, by and large. And by the way,
your ideas.
Well, I think, first of all, without unions, and you know this well, George, as a Teamster, without unions, it's really, really hard to organize these kind of things, which is why Reagan and the Republicans in 1980, when a third of the American workforce was unionized, decided to take down the unions, which they've done. The unionized workforce now in the United States is around 7 or 8% if you include federal workers, and just in the private sector it's around 5.5 or 6%. And number one, number two, this is why Mark Pocan on this program yesterday, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, came out and said very, very strongly that they want to pass legislation making it legal for government employees, for federal employees, to strike again, and absolutely agree on that.
I think it's kind of, not to put you down or anybody down, but I think we're thinking really linear, binary. We're thinking in the process of the younger generation, like my daughter and my neighbors. They have a whole different construct of what work is. I think I don't know the answer to it, but if we can get inside the young people's heads on how to interact with labor, because I boil it down to just don't go to work for 3 days and we could change almost anything that we want.
If you could get everybody to do that. But there's a lot of people who, if they don't show up for work, even after one day, they've lost their jobs.
Well, something, with the Uber, that type of work where they go half a day.
Gig work.
I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I don't have the answer. But,
I think a national strike is a great idea. You can see that in France right now, but France has got almost an 80% unionization, thing.
Right.
And I'm not sure.
India, the women did as well recently.
Right. So there's ways to do this, but fascinating. George, thank you for the call. James in Mineola, Texas. Hey, James. It says that you want to disagree with me about something.
Yes, because you're talking about that property tax on your car, right? Because of value of your car. I was in the military and owned a sports car. It was like an '88 Conquest. Mm-hmm. But the thing to me was making me mad is that I didn't have a lot of money. The thing that makes me mad is that you have 4 tires and I have 4 tires. What does it matter after that? My point, James, is if apparently Texas has a property tax on cars. Oregon doesn't, so I don't pay a tax on my car, but I do pay a tax on my home. And what I'm saying is that in the 25 states where there's a tax on cars, and in the 50 states where there's a tax on homes, these are property taxes, that what these are is actually wealth taxes. Now, I'm not speaking in favor or against that. Well, actually, I am. I'm speaking against them. You should be able to own your car. You should be able to own your home and not have to pay a tax on it every year, unless you're fabulously rich. But the argument that Howard Schultz is making is that people who are talking about taxing wealth, this is Elizabeth Warren's proposal that every year everybody who has more than $50 million pays 2% of whatever they own into the government as a tax. This will generate $1 trillion. This will fund all kinds of government programs. It'll give us free college education for everybody. Just all kinds of cool stuff comes out of this. And the billionaires are revolting. They're saying, how dare you talk about taking 2% of everything over 50 million? And Elizabeth Warren is like, what, you can't live on 50 million bucks? And, or 50 million plus 98% of everything else you've got? No, we can't live on it. And all I'm saying is that, and they're saying wealth taxes are un-American. Who in America would ever want a wealth tax? And I'm saying, wait a minute. James is paying a wealth tax on his car. I'm paying a wealth tax on my home. Why is it only the middle class has to pay a wealth tax? James, I suspect we are agreeing with each other. Well, not at all, because like I said, I have 75 acres in Lone Oak, Texas. I've had it the family has had it. I'm 5th generation to have this property. And remember, we're a descendant of slavery, all right? And they want to tell me now, it doesn't have any running water, there's no houses on there, anything like that. But now you have to have a certain amount of cows in order to get a tax break. You have to have a certain amount of goats, a certain amount of chickens to get a tax break. Yeah. How can you make me go into a business that I don't want to go into?
No, I'm agreeing with you, James. I'm saying you shouldn't be paying property tax to begin with. That we need to find a different way to fund schools. The whole, property tax funding of schools is why poor schools happen in poor areas and good schools happen in rich areas. That's nuts.
Well, our school taxes are I tell you right now, ours are going to be really, really high because I know you're not going to like this, because we let so many illegal immigrants go to our school, and we had to pay for that. We had to make that money up.
And we shouldn't be paying for that.
And so on.
Yeah, and you're going to have more of that in low-income areas that have high Hispanic populations. That shouldn't mean that the people who live in those areas who are U.S. citizens are getting crappy schools. We need to figure out a different way to fund our schools. I
can't believe that.
Yeah, I mean, this just makes sense. It's like we should be hitting people who have assets over $1 million with a 2% tax every year on their wealth. I agree with Elizabeth Warren, and we could do away with the property tax. And so if we're going to have a wealth tax in the United States, and we already do, it's crazy that you, with your house and your car, are paying a tax which is funding the local community, and rich people are not, with all of their assets, all of their wealth. Howard Schultz gets to have his giant money bin where he can dive into his pile of gold doubloons and bathe himself in gold, and he doesn't have to pay any tax on that at all. And you and I every year have to pay a tax on our homes or on our property or on your land in Texas. James, I agree with you. Thanks a lot for the call. Hope he didn't try to get to the front of the line by just saying I disagree. No, I don't think so. I think he misunderstood what I was saying. So I hope I'm really clear now. Everybody, we need a wealth tax in the United States on things beyond just James's car and my home. We need to figure out how to do this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 45 minutes past the hour. Your media support group for We the People, the Thom Hartmann Program. Back with more. And welcome back. Kai in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Kai, what's up?
Hey, Kai, Tom, thanks for taking my call. I'll be brief. First off, I'm a huge fan of Mondragon, the seventh largest company in Spain. I have a theoretical question for you.
Sure.
If we were to use, let's say, the Jobs Act of 2012, and we were to have, say, 1 million people or 100,000 people who all are signed on as owners of a corporation, let's say, if for nothing else than to troll the current Trump administration, would that work? Would we be able to take advantage of the tax benefits from his bill?
I must have missed something, Kai. What?
Well, if we were to, say, create an equity crowdfund, because
Sure.
There's no limit to the amount of people that can own a corporation, correct?
That's correct.
And there's no limit to the amount of buildings that one corporation can own. So can we, as citizens, band together and sort of take advantage of the
are you saying let's all get together, everybody kick in $1, get 1 million people to kick in $1, you now have $1 million. We all are stockholders in a corporation. That corporation then has all these rights and privileges that the Supreme Court has given it. It can now own politicians, and that $1 million goes to Washington, D.C. and is used. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely, because I believe that we can fight to get the money out of politics, but why not use jujitsu, so to speak, and beat them at their own game? Do we not have the power and the ability? I mean, with our schools are not training enough leaders. There are too many Indians and not enough chiefs, so to speak. But what I'm wondering is there any way where we can sort of use the vitriol against the people who created it in the first place? So if there were 1 million owners or 1 million shareholders of a single equity crowdfunding company, because that is my aim for the summer, is to start an assembly where we meet up every week. And we go through equity crowdfund opportunities, and we set them up, and we build businesses, because building businesses and setting our own wages is the only way that we're going to end income inequality in the United States. There's just no way. They are the gatekeepers of growth, and as long as they are gatekeepers over the growth, there's nothing we can do about that.
Yeah, no, broadly speaking, I agree with you. I don't think it's the only way. I think that a high marginal tax rate also encourages that kind of behavior. But it's the key way. It's the direct way. It's the honest,
Absolutely.
high integrity way. You're absolutely right, Kai. And this idea of basically creating a union, but calling it a for-profit corporation so that it can then exploit the benefits that have been given for-profit corporations by the Supreme Court since '76. That's pretty amazing. I need to think about that, Kai, but I think you're onto something.
Hey, well, I'm a huge fan. I study you, Dr. Rice, and Dr. Wolf.
Who is going to be with us in 15 minutes, by the way.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to take up too much of your time, but I
No,
really
it's good.
appreciate it. So it's possible. Theoretically, it's possible.
I think so. Yeah. What I'm trying to get my head around is where would the downside be to that?
Well, the downside would be their attack. They're switching up the rules to the game after the fact.
Yeah, that's a possibility. But as long as you represent yourself as a for-profit corporation, they'd be shooting themselves in the foot if they changed the rules.
Right. Well, we'd have to follow the leader. So imagine a cat chasing the mouse. But what happens when the mouse puts on a cat suit? They're going to make the cat suit illegal.
Yeah, perfect. Kai, thank you. Let me ponder this, but I think you're onto something. That's a great idea. I'm telling you, we've got the smartest viewers and listeners on earth. Kai, thanks a lot for that. It's 49 and a half minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. Oh, this is amazing. I just have to tell you, Donald Trump's saying Iran is a terrible threat and they're building bombs. And then the intel chiefs come before Congress and say, no, Iran's not building bombs and they're keeping to the deal. Trump says, North Korea, no problem anymore. I talked to Kim. They're not making bombs. The intel chiefs come to Congress and say, yep, South Korea is making bombs. Sure enough. In fact, they've got 20 facilities now doing this. Trump comes to the American people and says, we beat ISIS in Syria and we're going to pull out and just leave Syria to the Syrians and the Russians and the Iranians. And the intelligence people come before Congress and say, no, ISIS is still alive and well in Syria. In fact, they're flourishing. And then Trump today, just literally a few minutes ago, in the White House, invited the press in to a meeting that he's got, a cabinet meeting, I believe it is, and said, time's going to prove me right. I'm right, the intelligence chiefs are wrong, but you're not going to know this for another 10 or 15 years. We'll all look back on this and go, oh, yeah, Trump was right. This is insane. This guy is delusional. Nancy in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Hey, Nancy, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I love your show.
Thank you.
And on the subject of the property tax, I wanted to also point out that most people don't own their home outright, so they're paying this tax on debt.
Yeah, actually, it's even worse. I mean, if you own a home that's worth $100,000 and you have a $90,000 mortgage on it, and the property tax on that house is, say, $1,000 a year, 1%, you're paying actually $1,000 a year on an equity of $10,000. So you're functionally paying a 10% wealth tax. That is the wealth that you have. The wealth that the bank has is $90,000. The wealth that you have is $10,000. You pay $1,000 a year in property tax on that, and you're paying a 10% wealth tax. That's insane. You're right, Nancy. You're absolutely right.
Well, thank you.
That's brilliant. This is great. We're crowdsourcing this information. Nancy, thank you so much. Lou in Pueblo, Colorado. Hey, Lou, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Great show. Hey, I just wanted to comment. I keep hearing people trying to paint AOC as some sort of radical. But if you pull up the 1956 Republican political platform, it's a little bit to the left of AOC.
Yes.
So AOC is to the right of the 1956 mainstream Republicans. Guy named Eisenhower, you may have heard of.
Yep. She is not calling for taxes that are as high as those that Eisenhower was all in favor of. Eisenhower had a 91% top tax rate, and he embraced it. Eisenhower ran for re-election in 1956 on the fact that he had put millions, with an S, millions of people on union payrolls, that he had added millions of people to Social Security, that he had expanded Social Security benefits, that he had engaged in a huge nationwide construction program that put people back to work, an infrastructure program called the National Highway System. What am I missing, Lou?
You know how they excluded that income from taxes?
Yeah.
If they bought infrastructure bonds or reinvested in industry, the money was tax-free. They could buy an infrastructure bond. And why is not the Democratic Party going out and telling everyone, we are the Republican Party 1956, people?
I think the main reason is most Americans are not old enough to remember the Republican Party. Frankly, I'm not old enough to remember the Republican Party in 1956. I was 5 years old that year. But I have a vague recollection of the Eisenhower administration. But most people just don't, they're not old enough to remember this. And those of us who are need to make one of our jobs waking up young people to what America could be. I mean, those benefits were largely or more available, let's say wildly more available to white people than everybody else in this country, and to men and than everybody else in this country. We have to acknowledge that and make this more inclusive. We redo it and do it right this time. But, that said, there is a model there for how a country can work. And it's, by the way, a model that is being used right now by pretty much every country in Europe and half the countries in Central and South America. Amen.
And it works.
Yeah, it does. And Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. Thank you, Lou, for the call. Patrick in Albuquerque, New Mexico, listening on KABQ. You have a nomination for worst cabinet member?
Well, it's a hard-fought contest, to be sure, and thanks for taking my call.
It is.
But my vote is for Betsy DeVos. And here's why. All the guys you listed, I think what we're doing is refighting the Civil War, and we have to do that every few generations. And it's all the the prejudice and the patriarchy and the gross distribution of wealth and all the things that made antebellum South the antebellum South. I think we're in the middle of that, right?
I agree.
Betsy DeVos is different. Betsy DeVos is actively trying to dismantle a real education for the middle class,
public education,
and that's been going on for a while.
She's accomplished this in Michigan. Half the schools in Michigan now are private for-profit schools, or private schools, charter schools.
And the charter schools, are sort of the new segregation in a lot of areas.
Yep.
Not so much in New Mexico because we're more racially diverse than most states. But I've always said for a long, long time that the real conservative conspiracy is to try to make sure that the middle class is not well educated. And it used to be sort of this wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing, and a lot of dog whistles. But she's gone completely beyond that. She says, she pretty much just says outright in the subtext of nearly everything she says is that the middle class and the lower income levels do not deserve an education, and it is in fact how you enslave a population.
Yeah, this is their version of survival of the fittest. I mean, they believe in social Darwinism, basically.
Yep.
And go ahead.
Well, you've brought up so many things in the meantime that my head was reeling. We've got so many issues right now. It's really, really hard to keep track of all this stuff. But I would like to remind all of your listeners that they are the board of directors of the United States of America. Get out there and vote and be politically active. There is never been a time when that is more important. And vote with your dollars too. In a free market economy, every time we spend a dollar, we vote.
Yeah, which leads me to wonder if there's a Starbucks boycott on the horizon.
Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby are the first ones on my list.
Yeah.
But it's a long list.
Yeah, there you go. And then, the products of Coke Industries, et cetera, et cetera. Patrick, thank you for the call. Well said, and thanks for listening to KABQ. Up next, Richard Wolff, the economist, is going to be with us, as he is pretty much every Thursday in the second hour of our program. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 58 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
just did a rant about how we have actually passed a major climate change tipping point that we can't walk back from. We can't stop it. This is coming now. It is unstoppable. This first step of it, which has to do with, the destruction of major cities in the United States and all around the world. You can check this out over at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, or for people who support us on YouTube as well, you can see this. Get over to patreon.com/THOMHARTMANN to check this out. We're talking about how prior to a couple of years ago, and this is how, tipping points, you can only see them in the rearview mirror. Prior to a couple of years ago, in the winter, the Antarctic and Greenland would recover some of their ice. Now they're not even doing that. It's just pausing. The melting is just pausing. That's that tipping point. And the consequences of this are going to be terrible. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Gar Alperovitz's book, What Then Must We Do? Gar is an economist, by the way. And this is from the introduction. I've borrowed my title, What Then Must We Do, from Tolstoy and the profoundly disturbing 1886 book that he wrote once he began to dig below the surface of what was happening in late 19th century Russia, a time when the system was in decay, the aristocracy enjoyed extraordinary luxury, and the peasants endured lives of hunger and pain. As a person of privilege, he began to understand something deeper about his time in history. Tolstoy wrote, I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am very sorry for him and wish to ease his lot by all means possible, except by getting off his back. Most of us do not literally sit on men's backs, making them carry us. We do, however, often uneasily look the other way, satisfying ourselves with modest changes that reassure us that all is well, while millions are in despair. We've done the best we can do, we might say, given the realities. Still, many sense, as did Tolstoy, that to actually do something serious would require us to confront much deeper problems than we are commonly willing to do. What then must we do is not shouted in the streets, but it is a question that more and more Americans, young and old, liberal, radical, and conservative, are quietly beginning to ask themselves in much more penetrating ways. So let us begin. My starting point is the obvious fact that despite its great wealth, the United States faces today enormous difficulties, with no easily discernible political answers that even begin to offer strategic handholds on a truly democratic future. Elections occur and major fiscal debates ensue, but many of the most pressing problems facing ordinary citizens are only marginally affected, and in many cases in ways that increase burdens, not reduce them. The issue is not simply that our situation is worrisome, however. It is that there are growing reasons to believe that we in fact face systemic problems, not simply political ones. Systemic problems in the fundamental, not the superficial sense. In the pages ahead, I will suggest that our nation's truly critical problems are built into the very structure of the economic and political system. They are not something passing in the night that will go away even when we elect forward-looking thinkers and actively pressure them to move in a different direction. I won't load you down with statistics at this point. A couple of obvious reminders, however. Not only has the economy been stagnating for a long time, but for the average person and the average family, things have been bad for a very long time. Real wages for 80% of Americans' workers, for example, have not gone up more than a trivial amount for the last 3 decades. At the same time, income for the top 1% has jumped from nearly 10% of all income to roughly 20% of all income. Put another way, virtually all of the gains of the entire economic system have gone to the tiny, tiny group at the top for at least 3 decades. Worth pausing to think about that one. What's going on when virtually all the gains for the entire economic system go to the top? I'm not interested here in criticizing those at the top. The question is, we can do that later, the question is, what is going on with the system when this kind of thing happens and continues to happen in an ongoing way, year after year, decade after decade? Another reminder, almost 50 million Americans live in officially defined poverty. The rate is higher, not lower, than in the late 1960s, another disturbing trend marker. Moreover, if we use the measuring standard common throughout the advanced world, which considers the poverty level to be half the median income level, the number would be just under 70 million, and the rate would be almost 23% of all Americans living in poverty. That is to say nothing of steady increases in global warming and an unemployment rate that, if properly measured, is stuck in the range of roughly 15%. At the most superficial level, Washington, as the saying goes, is broken. Give or take an occasional gain in selected areas, the political system is simply incapable of dealing with the deeper challenges. It focuses on deficits, not answers. Long trends that don't change are a clear signal that it's not simply the modern period of partisan bickering and congressional stalemate that is causing the problems. The trends are moving steadily downward. We're moving steadily downward long before the Tea Party and the recent partisan foolishness, long before the Citizens United Supreme Court decision allowed corporations to put big money directly into politics, and long before many events that have heralded as tipping points one kind or another. Nor are people stupid. More and more have a sense that something different is going on, both with the economy and more fundamentally with democracy itself. A few more bits of information just as reminders again of something that we're all beginning to see. A mid-2011 poll found that roughly 80% of Americans believe their congressional representatives to be, quote, more interested in serving the needs of special interest groups than the people they represent, end quote. Another poll found that almost 4 out of 5 believe a few rich people in corporations have far too much power. And only 37% of Americans, much more than a third of the population, have confidence in the most solemn and august of American institutions, the Supreme Court. I'm going to dig much, much deeper into all of this, of course, but for now, let's leave it at this. When critical, long trends do not improve, when they steadily get worse year in and year out, it is clear that we face deeply rooted systemic problems, not simply political problems in the usual sense of the term. Moreover, as these polls suggest, people increasingly understand that something is really wrong. The question is, how do we deal with a systemic crisis, something built into the way the political economy works, rather than just a simple political or economic crisis? Garo Parvitz, what then must we do?
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. 6 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Welcome back to the second hour of our program. On the line, we've been talking in the previous hour about how do we bring about a wealth tax in the United States that extends beyond just the wealth tax that middle class Americans pay. I pay property tax on my home. Jim down in Texas pays a property tax on his car. This is crazy. Middle class people are paying wealth taxes, but Howard Schultz pays nothing on his money bin. Shouldn't he? So anyhow, we've been talking about that and continuing the conversation about economics broadly. Dr. Richard Wolff is with us, the economist, the co-founder of Democracy at Work. DemocracyAtWork.info is the website. He's the author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. rdwolf with 2fs.com, also his other website. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolf, as in Professor Wolf. Professor Wolf, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
So I noticed that when the Fed started tightening the money supply, started raising interest rates about a year ago or so, a little more than a year ago, that the stock market slowed down and then kind of went into reverse. Donald Trump comes out and says, this is all because the Fed is raising interest rates, and the Chairman Powell needs to grovel at my feet and stop this. And then over the last couple of weeks, Chairman Powell came out and used some very specific language here, said, and I quote, we are going to be patient about interest rate increases. And he says we're going to remove forward guidance. In other words, we're going to stop explicitly signaling that rate increases are coming. And some are reading this as him saying that, in fact, there will be no more rate increases, at least for a couple of years, at least as long as Donald Trump is president, which, of course, is what Trump wants. A, is that, a reasonable assessment of what's going on? B, if the Fed doesn't raise interest rates above 2%, doesn't that knock out our ability, the Fed's ability anyway, to deal with a serious recession, which is generally considered inevitable? And C, if so, is this a naked political cave on the part of Powell to Trump? And how will that play politically? I mean, if he can keep the stock market up until Trump runs for re-election, does that mean that right after that we're going to see the world's worst crash? as soon as a Democrat becomes president in 2020. I realize there's a lot to unpack there, Dr. Wolf, but go for it, please.
All right, I will try. Number one, yes, you're absolutely right that the purpose of slowing down the increase in rates or being patient, if that means no more rates, is caving in. But it is not just caving in to President Trump, although it's partly that. It's also caving in to pressure from the business community and particularly from the biggest businesses whose stocks trade on the market. Because as you rightly pointed out, the minute the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates to deal with the enormous overhang of new money pumped into the economy to offset the 2008 crash, the minute the interest rates started going up, the stock market started having problems. And the reason for that, people should understand, is that big players in the stock market use borrowed money. They have to pay interest on that money, and if it becomes more expensive to borrow the money, which is what rising interest rates mean, they will not play in the stock market because the risk becomes too expensive relative to the chances of gain. So it was caving in both to the president and to big business and the stock market that they put the brakes on the rising interest rates that they had been raising gently, but for a year and a half now. Add to that the slowing global economy, particularly big problems in Europe and now significant slowdown in China, partly, by the way, also the result of the Trump administration, and you have enough negative factors that raising interest rates would add to the risks of a recession or make a recession that happens anyway even worse. So if you put all those factors together, that was more than enough to get Mr. Powell and the members of the board, the Federal Reserve Board, to cave in. That's the first part.
Okay.
The second part is it is very good news for Mr. Trump, because if you raise interest rates, you make it more expensive to use your credit card, to buy a home with a mortgage, to buy a car with your payments. And so the fact that they raised them was slowing all those markets down, and that would hurt people's pocketbooks, and they would blame the president, as people often do. So it's not good for him to have the rising rates. It's much better for him either to stop the rise or to get the rates to come down. And finally, you are also right. I guess you get an A today, Tom. You are also right to foresee that you're stalling things off, accumulating debts that people cannot pay, sets the basis for a humongous crash once the election is over, once the pressure is off, et cetera, et cetera. One of the reasons the Federal Reserve over the last year and a half raised interest rates, which they said, was because they noticed that the low interest rates they had had since 2008 had led governments and businesses to borrow historically unprecedented amounts of money.
And households.
Creating a great deal of risk that a downturn would lead to a cascade of unpaid borrowing. And to stop that and to now give another 2 years of a free ride at low interest rate does indeed and should make people much more nervous than they even were when the current upswing in interest rates was begun a year and a half ago.
So we're looking at the crash of 2020 being one of epic proportions, if all of this speculation and math and whatnot is right.
That's right. And it means you're facing again one of the many dysfunctional aspects of how we run American capitalism. We create a president and a political party whose horizon is the next election and who will, as we have seen over and over again, subordinate longer-term conditions for the economy and for the mass of people to the short-term prospects of their electoral strategy. That is a very dangerous way to run your society, and while it can get you over the difficulty this time and that time, it's only a matter of time before this happens in a way that can't be fixed afterwards, or at least not without massive suffering, even exceeding what we saw in the wake of 2008.
Amazing. These guys are like, they're so playing with fire. Meanwhile, yesterday at the White House, Donald Trump invited Herman Cain to come by. Apparently there's, not apparently, there are 2 seats open on the Fed, for the National Fed Board. And apparently he's considering Herman Cain for one of those. Your thoughts?
Well, given the kinds of appointments Mr. Trump has already made, ending up a couple of weeks ago with Mr. Abrams on the Venezuela issue, right. You have to shake your head in utter disbelief. Not only is there no meritocracy involved, there never was much, but now it's not only negative. It boggles the mind that a person of those capable of saying the things we know that man said would be given a position of that sort. I guess it's, again, loyalty to Mr. Trump, being a useful tool for whatever comes to his Twitter mind. That's what this is about. But what it will do is further diminish the respect and the seriousness with which people did for a while take the statements of the Federal Reserve, which gave a certain logic. Americans don't like planning, but the statements of the Federal Reserve were, of course, a kind of planning. They were signaling to the business community what the interest rate, what the money situation will be. That's what a planning government would do anyway, and we're now going to diminish the relevance and the respect of the planning that we do, which makes us even more chaotic as an economy than we already were.
Finally, Professor Wolf, I'm curious your thoughts on the 2% wealth tax that Elizabeth Warren has proposed on all wealth over $50 million. You heard part of my rant about how this is just, how is this different from a property tax? And which is, I think, therefore, we have a precedent in this country for having a wealth tax. And also the proposal of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of a 70% top marginal tax rate on income over $10 million a year.
Well, let's unpack that just very briefly. The property tax. As you correctly said in your prior remarks, the property tax in this country is an ethical abomination. We tax land, we tax homes, we tax automobiles, we even tax some business inventories. But if you hold your wealth not in those forms, which are the forms that middle and low-income people have property, if they have any property at all, but if you tax that and you don't tax stocks and bonds, which is how the rich people in this country hold the bulk of their property, then your property tax is discriminatory. It's favoring the richest amongst us and penalizing everybody else. It is outrageous that the property tax has only been applied to what is called in economics tangible property, stuff you can touch and feel, and not to the financial property, stocks, bonds, and things that are represented by pieces of paper. Had we applied the same property tax rates that we now impose on every community in this country's land and homes and cars, had we applied that to the stocks and bonds property held by the top 10% of our people, there would be no government deficit, even in the situation of fixing the crash of 2008. It is an outrage beyond words. Number two, there is precedent. I did research myself on the history of property taxes in Connecticut, which are among the highest in the United States. And it turned out, surprise, surprise, that in the earliest days of the state of Connecticut, the first property tax imposed was a tax on shares of stock in a canal linking New Haven, Connecticut with Hartford, Connecticut, the capital. So we have in our history, indeed, in many states of the United States, we have had property taxes imposed on intangible property, stocks and bonds. So this is not a new thing. It's not without precedent. It has existed in the United States, and it is only massive a prevention of people grasping this reality that has allowed rich people to impose a property tax on everybody else and exempt themselves. It is really extraordinary.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
That was a brilliant analysis, Dr. Richard Wolf. Thanks so much for being with us.
All right, Tom. Look forward to the next time.
Thanks. Great talking to you. democracyatwork.info. And welcome back. John in Topanga, California. Hey, John, thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's up?
You mentioned this in a segment. I swear I was in the queue before you said so on this subject. My question is it not time to start boycotting Starbucks in order to hold down the value of Howard Schultz's stock and hit him where he breathes?
You know, if there was a yes, is the answer, John. And I think that if Howard Schultz actually declares a candidacy, my opinion is that this is all smoke and mirrors, that this is all, you know, Howard Schultz doesn't actually want to be president. I mean, he might want to be president, but he doesn't actually he doesn't take that seriously. He doesn't think that he has any chance at all of being president. The guy is not an idiot. I think, you know, he's on book tour right now, right? And, you know, think back to Ann Coulter, right? When does she say really outrageous things like women shouldn't be in the workforce? She always says that when she's on book tour because she wants to get publicity because she wants to sell her book. You know, in my opinion, what Howard Schultz is doing right now is he's trying to sell his book. He's trying to become a famous guy. He wants to be thought of as one of those thoughtful billionaires. You know, sort of like Tom Friedman, I suppose. You know, a guy who, when he writes an op-ed, you should pay attention. When he goes to Davos, they should cluster around him and listen carefully to what he has to say. That, in my opinion, is what's going on, John. But if he takes it to the next step, if he actually files and says, yes, I am running for president, and I've filed in more than one state, and it's a real run, and he's trying to do a John Anderson or a Ross Perot, a third-party run like this, I think that, you know, we all need to get together and take down that effort. I mean, you know, just and I think one of the great ways to do that would be to absolutely organize a nationwide boycott of Starbucks and reduce the value of his stock and you know, hit him in a place where he's going to seriously pay attention. I doubt that's going to happen, though, John, because I think this is just a stunt to sell books.
Okay, I feel better, but I'll be waiting for the signal if the time comes.
Yeah, amen. And I think you're not alone. I think there's a lot of us feeling that way. Thanks a lot for the call, John. Jesse in Miami. Hey, Jesse, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Well, I'm talking about the taxes so much, I got to get this in real quick.
Okay.
Henry George, Progress and Poverty, they call him the father of taxes.
Yep.
But that wasn't his intention. But the main thing, the tax thing, talking about businesses, you know, waltzing on their deal with, you know, I mean, making them hold to the deal when if they want tax money to do business, the federal government should hold a federal fund to make sure they, you know, keep to their word. And then I look at China as being accused of stealing trade, intellectual rights, and all. It just, if I was from outer space, I would get the feeling that to keep doing business with capitalism, you just can't trust them.
Yeah.
Why do business with something you cannot trust?
Well, that's the core nature of capitalism, is that the first thing is profit. It's not, you know, what's best for the community or best for the world or even best for the customers.
Yeah. I mean, we done bailed capitalism out so many times, and they just screw us. Well, thank you. Are we still crazy to still be trying to talk business?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. But I agree with you, Jesse, and very well said. Thank you very much for the call. It's 22 and a half minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Just did a rant about how we have actually passed a major climate change tipping point that we can't walk back from. We can't stop it. This is coming now. It is unstoppable. This first step of it, which has to do with, you know, the destruction of major cities in the United States and all around the world. You can check this out over at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, or for people who support us on YouTube as well, you can see this. Get over to patreon.com/THOMHARTMANN to check this out. We're talking about how prior to a couple of years ago, and this is how, tipping points, you can only see them in the rearview mirror. Prior to a couple of years ago, in the winter, the Arctic and Greenland, the Antarctic and Greenland would recover some of their ice. Now they're not even doing that. It's just pausing. The melting is just pausing. That's that tipping point. And the consequences of this are going to be terrible. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hartmann here with you, and Denise in Calumet, Michigan. Hey, Denise, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. The first time I saw this Howard Schultz on 60 Minutes, I felt like he looked like a snake. I didn't like what he said. But the next day, you talked about how his campaign manager was from John McCain's.
Yeah, Steve Smith? No, Steve
right.
Schmidt.
So
That's right, Steve Schmidt.
So now I'm thinking he's got a Republican campaign manager. I don't think he really wants to be president, and I think there might be more behind his running to take votes away to make Trump president again.
It's not inconceivable, Denise. I think this is a stunt to sell books, but I could be wrong. I mean, it could be that Howard Schultz really thinks that. I just don't get it. I mean, he literally, as a caller early in the last hour talked about, he is literally to the right of Dwight Eisenhower. In 1956, when Eisenhower ran for re-election, well, in 52, he ran as the peace candidate. Vote for Eisenhower, vote for peace was his slogan. We've played that ad on this program many, many times over the years. In 56, he ran for re-election on the fact that he'd added more than 2 million people to the rolls of the unions, over 1 million people to the rolls of Social Security. He'd expanded union membership. He had expanded Social Security benefits. He had borrowed, in today's dollars, would be $1 trillion to build a national highway system, an infrastructure system that put people back to work, that he was building schools and hospitals all over the country with federal funds. I mean, this is the stuff that Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican, and Richard Nixon was his vice president. This is what they ran for re-election in 1956 on, and that's too far to the left for Howard Schultz. I mean, how can you even rationally? I mean, this is nuts. So, Denise, I think you're right, and I think your concerns are right. Denise, thank you for the call. Chris in Palatine, Illinois. Hey, Chris, what's up?
Yes, Tom. Regarding your wealth tax on stocks and bonds, et cetera. Right. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but what happens when we had situations like have happened quite frequently, where like in 2008, where the stock market drops and it loses 70% of its value?
Then your taxes go down.
Okay, but then what happens when all you're simply doing then is earning that money back? So when the stock market goes back up,
there's an easy solution to that, Chris. And we used to have this, by the way. We have it now for corporations, but it used to be there for individuals, for people. Back in, I don't know when it went away, probably during Reagan, during the 80s, but certainly this was the case in the 70s, that there was this 3-year window. And if you had a loss...
I understand. You're talking about tax averaging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that very well. The other issue, though, is a significant amount of the stock market is being held by mutual funds, by individual people, individual investors.
Right.
Yes. So they're getting so basically putting a tax on that is basically reducing their potential income.
Potentially, and that's something that would have to be worked out. I think that this should be a property tax. And, the property tax is dealt with in different ways depending on who is owning the property. We should just do the same thing. Chris, thanks for the call.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's 28 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day right after this. For our book club today, we're reading from a book edited by Cynthia McKinney. It's a compiled collection of essays titled "How the U.S. Creates, Shall we say, S-hole countries." I can't say that word on the air. And this is from her introduction, a deeper look at Trump's epithet, S-hole country. I wish I could take full credit for the idea of doing a book on President Trump's unfortunate characterization of some countries as S-hole countries, verified recently by fired ex-White House staffer Omarosa Manigault. The idea was brought to me by a Facebook friend, and I immediately saw the brilliance of that idea. Although at the time the president tried to walk back the revelation that he used such language to describe certain countries, he couldn't help himself. And during the visit of Nigeria's president to the White House, he doubled down on that characterization, saying that certain countries were tough places to live. It was only recently that Omarosa confirmed that, yes, the president had described certain countries as asshole countries. The media had a field day with the, at the time, alleged remarks. Steve Dempsey of the Bay Area News Group compiled a slideshow of cartoons from national news outlets that lambasted the president. Lambasted, whatever it is. The Mercury News Online ran the slideshow that included hilarious cartoons by Rick McKee at the Augustus Chronicle and Bob Englehart with Kago Cartoons and others. Mark Schuller, writing in the Huffington Post, noted, Haiti has been targeted for its decisive role in challenging what Southern planters, including 8 U.S. presidents, called a peculiar institution. The Haitian Revolution was the first time slaves were able to permanently end slavery and forge an independent nation. It was also a tipping point in U.S. history, leading to the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, paving the way for U.S. manifest destiny stretching from sea to shining sea and eventual dominance. Chicago, the country's third largest city, was founded by a Haitian, Jean-Baptiste Pont-du-Sable, who Haitian historian Marc Rosier called an agent of the Haitian government to pursue a pro-freedom international policy. End of quote from that. Jen Kirby went farther, and in an online media outlet, Vox, interview with a Stanford University history professor, the word eugenics was used as a descriptor for what Trump's characterization actually represented. Stanford professor Anna Minion said of the interview, what Trump said was basically a form of eugenics, in which he's saying, this is the population we want, people from places like Norway, white people. We don't want people from African countries or from Haiti. That's what's really symbolic here. Minion makes it clear that in the U.S. immigration debate, legality became a proxy for race without anyone overtly talking about it. Ryan Teague Beckwith and Maya Roden of Time magazine added their 2 cents worth to the discussion of the president's choice of words by choosing to discuss the immigration laws that occasioned Trump's telling words. They began their discussion this way. President Donald Trump's S-hole countries comment ricocheted around the world, spurring criticism from U.S. allies, rebuttals from Americans with roots in those countries, and condemnation from some in his own party. Reaction was swift around the world, including from those countries so characterized by the president. Zambia even humorously featured Trump's words in a tourism advertisement at Appeal. My Facebook friend thought that the president's words should occasion a deeper look at what these so-called S-hole countries were, how they were created, and why they continue to exist. And that is exactly what the contributors to this book do. Sort of like the proverbial turtle sitting on a fence post, you know these countries didn't get the way they are without some help. And it's precisely that help from the U.S., its allies, its multinational corporations, its military, and United Nations peacekeeping operations in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which it also controls, on which this book focuses. Thus, the U.S. relationship to conditions in these countries is clear from U.S. military occupation of Haiti, financing of death squads in El Salvador, and support for dictators in all of them, indeed, all across the African continent. Therefore, for our purposes, an S-hole country is a country whose residents present quality of living conditions that can be tied to historical or current U.S. foreign and military policies that have negatively impacted the ability of that state to deliver quality of life policies to its residents. In this regard, for too many U.S. residents, the U.S. itself could be characterized as an S-hole country, resulting from its deliberate choice to fund the war machine and corporate policies that produce negative consequences for the countries and territories, in some cases colonies, that are profiled here. The United States, as itself a S-hole country, could be explored in much depth in future efforts. The characterization of certain countries as S-hole countries has captured the imagination of the global community, whether the localities and individuals concerned are for or against U.S. President Donald J. Trump. This book seizes this unique moment when attention of people inside and outside the U.S. is focused on the president's alleged words to explain the structure of international politics, the conditions inside certain countries, specific U.S. policies that created or maintain those conditions, and the consequence of those policies on U.S. residents themselves. How the U.S. Creates S-Hole Countries by Cynthia McKinney, or edited by.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Well, Herman Cain as Federal Reserve, but that was Mr. 999, right? He had this tax plan. Very strange stuff. He was a pizza king, right? Jerome Powell saying, yeah, we'll do whatever we want. We were talking earlier about who is the worst cabinet secretary. Is it Wilbur Ross? Is it Rick Perry? Is it Betsy DeVos? How about Andrew Wheeler, former coal lobbyist who's now running the EPA? Yes, seriously. Or David Bernhardt, the former oil lobbyist who's now running the Department of Interior. Or the former drug company executive, Alex Azar, who's now running HHS, Health and Human Services. Really? Anyhow, Justin in Lincoln, Nebraska. Hey, Justin, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching us on Free Speech.
Well, I need some help. I need some information, I guess. Just like everybody else, I guess the county assessor, sends out everybody information telling them that their property tax went up. And well, I kind of was watching your show yesterday. I kind of made a suggestion. I was like, well, we could tax some billionaires a little bit more money. And then I met with, that's socialism, or, you're a socialist, or why, stuff like that. And there's no way I can really, I don't know how to, I don't know what to come back with them. I was thinking, if I just had if I could just print off a piece of paper that showed them how much more these billionaires are making, as opposed to, or what the tax cuts, like you were saying yesterday, like the Koch brothers. I don't know what you said. I forgot what it was. But
their capital gains income, I think, that pass-through income, the income that billionaires on Wall Street make, it's called carried interest, is now taxed at 15%. Capital gains, I think, are now taxed at 20%. Corporate income is now taxed at 21%. All of these used to be above 50%. I mean, it's just, so it's, there's just, I mean, I don't think you even need to quote numbers, Justin. The simple reality is that the richer you get, the less you pay in taxes. And I think everybody in America understands that. And that's why there's so much outrage about people like Howard Schultz saying, yeah, I'll be president. What's my qualification? I made $1 billion. I kept my workers' wages down for years and years and took all that extra money. And I shoveled out lots and lots of coffee. Or I put a lot of small independent businesses out of business and made a lot of money. Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the problem I'm having is I can't talk to him about it. Like, for instance, my brother, he claims to be a Democrat. But I think he voted for Donald Trump, mainly on the gun issue. But, he'll say the same thing to me. He'd be like, well, that's socialism, if you want to tax people more because they're successful. And I just don't see it the same way. I wish there was like a bar graph or a pie chart to show him that I could just print off and, just have all the facts right there, because I don't think anybody's really going to listen to me. I just don't feel like that's happening.
Yeah. There are a couple of websites. The Economic Policy Institute is actually a great place for this kind of information. This is, Dean Baker's thing. That's EPI.org. There's another one, and I just was looking it up. I thought it was the Center for Economic Policy, but it apparently is not. That's apparently one in the UK. Progressive Policy. ProgressivePolicy.org is another one. Economic Policy, ProgressivePolicy.org.
EPI.org,
ProgressivePolicy.org.
Okay. I'll check those sites out.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what I wanted to say. That's kind of the attitude coming from people around here. Well, the taxes are going up.
I found the CEPR.
We got a Republican governor, so.
Yeah, Dean Baker's the CEPR. The probably the best one is CEPR.net, and the .org is the British one, but the U.S. one is CEPR.net, Center for Economic Policy Research, and that's worth checking out. Justin, I got to move along, but thank you. Good luck. Good luck. I wish you the very best. Steve in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how are you?
Great. What's on your mind?
Basically, I just wanted to make a comment. It was kind of about basically, when people say they want the government to run like a business, it made me think Donald Trump. They asked him what he thought about the people not getting paid during the shutdown, and his comment was, "Well, they'll manage. They always do." And it's kind of just like when big companies lay people off, they'll say, they don't have to worry about those people because they'll manage. They always do.
Right.
Or
It's what I'm sure it's what Trump used to say whenever he would screw a contractor.
What's that?
I said I'm guessing this is what Trump used to say to himself and the people around him whenever he would screw a contractor or refuse to pay bills or declare bankruptcy. Yeah, they'll manage. They always do.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, Steve, that the whole idea of running government like a business or running government like a household is insane. But specifically, running government like a business. The first goal of a business is to make a profit. What is the first goal of a government?
It should be to take care of the people's needs.
Right. It should be the welfare of its people. I mean, the general welfare is mentioned 3 different times in the Constitution. So if the first goal of government is to provide for the welfare of its people, then how do you run that like a business?
You can't.
Right, exactly. You run it like a government. Governments and businesses are fundamentally different kinds of entities. They have different purposes. They're brought into existence for different reasons. And therefore, anybody who says the government should run like a business is simply proclaiming the fact that they are an idiot, that they are ahistoric, that they are uneducated, that they know nothing about economics and they know nothing about civics. That's what's going on. Steve, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Tony in Round Lake, Illinois. Hey, Tony, what's up?
Hey, man, I've been sitting here listening to the show. It's a great show. I cannot believe that we are in a position where we are discussing, essentially, just like you were saying, our country running like a business when I believe, just like church and state, based on freedom of religion, the government should be separate from corporate entities, and we should remove those contributions from the political spectrum. If we don't do something about that, then they're just going to continue to own our government, and they make the laws pass that they abide by and really have no consequences. If a corporation, for instance, dumps hazardous waste into a ravine, they don't really go to jail for that. They might pay a fraction of their profits in fines, but nobody really suffers. Now, if I go out and hurt someone, poison someone, I'm going to jail for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
We treat corporations like people as opposed to, corporations.
Yeah. No, and it goes beyond that, Tony. In 1907, President Teddy Roosevelt proposed a law which would cause any officer, any employee, any officer or lawyer working on behalf of any corporation in America who gives any money to any federal candidate for office, that officer, that lawyer, will go to prison for up to 2 years. And that law, and Teddy Roosevelt proposed that, and Americans said, yes, we need this. And Congress debated it, the House debated it, the Senate debated it, and, it was a very business-friendly Congress back then, and they said yes. And they passed that law in 1907. It's called the Tillman Act. And from 1907 until 2010, it was a felony in the United States for a corporation to give money to a federal candidate for office. And then, of course, the Supreme Court blew that up with the Citizens United decision in October of 2010. But Tony, you're onto something. I mean, this is something that there was a broad consensus about. Go ahead.
It's not going to change anything. We're going to continue to have these rich people making our laws that they can basically do what they want.
Yep.
Because even the way the justice system is now, if you don't have money and you commit a crime, either innocent, even if you don't commit a crime, if you're charged with a crime and don't have the money to the right.
Yeah, if you don't have the money for a good lawyer, you're screwed. Yeah, and that's just it's so wrong. I mean, we have a multi-tiered justice system too, and all of this has come out of the basically rich people owning politicians, and it's come out of the Supreme Court saying just fine with us. Tony, spot on. Thanks for the call. Tim in Beaverton, Oregon. Hey, Tim, what's up?
Yeah, I've been watching your program. Well, I'm retired now, so I have a little more time on my hands. But a real summary of this whole thing is what's what's really becoming unfortunate is that with this push towards who's going to be a Democratic candidate for 2020, we should be concerned with the everyday process that's going on right now. Every day that man is in office, he's doing irreparable damage to this country.
I agree, but I think Mike Pence will do the exact same thing, Tim.
Oh, absolutely, and that's what I've said. You know, he's keeping quiet in the background because he's in the catbird seat.
Yep.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, and therefore, if you're looking at the possibility of a crazy man in the White House starting an international, nuclear war or something, yes, Trump actually represents that kind of a threat to us, and I doubt Pence would. But in every other regard, if you're talking about, poisoning our air, poisoning our water, doing away with our public schools, further restricting the rights of labor, further restricting the rights of ordinary people, doing away with the rights of consumers, encouraging more big corporations and banksters and whatnot to behave badly, Mike Pence is as bad as Trump. And in many cases, in those that we just talked about, Tim, he actually may be worse because he'll be more effective than Trump.
That's the scary part. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was just listening to you talking about Roosevelt. I have 2 degrees in history, and there's a question I always ask a lot of my friends who are involved in education. I say, what's the most important assassination in the last 120 years? And of course, they talk about Kennedy and Martin Luther King and any number of people, but and nobody's ever got it right. But I say McKinley.
Yeah,
that changed the world.
Yep.
People don't understand how significant that was for the first 20 years of the 20th century.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Tim, thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from a fellow history buff. Apparently, you've done it formally. Did it the right way. Tim, thank you so much. And thanks for watching Free Speech TV. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll be back in 4 minutes. We're going to check in with Talk Media News, find out what's up in the world, and with Bob Ney, in fact. So stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
So how do we expand the property tax to include Howard Schultz's money bin? And who's the worst member of Trump's cabinet? And welcome back. Brian in North Branch, Minnesota. Hey, Brian, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I would like to nominate Wilbur Ross as the worst member of the Spanky administration cabinet.
Yeah.
He is a pompous individual. Years ago, coal miners lost their lives in a company that was under his watch. He showed a total disregard for worker safety, and now we have his recent tone-deaf comments, total lack of compassion for 800,000 federal workers not receiving paychecks. It's not that big a deal to him. It's irrelevant to him. He's a sociopath. He has no conscience. Wilbur Ross does not have a soul.
He is a mini-me of Donald Trump. Do you remember when was it Forbes or Fortune who wrote a long, when Ross was made Commerce Secretary, they wrote a long piece on how they actually called him a grifter and said that every major deal that he's been involved in over the last 20 years, if you talk to his business partners, they say that he screwed them.
Yeah, he's just...
Wilbur Ross. I'm with you, Brian. Although, there's just so much evil in the Trump cabinet. Paul in Glenside, Pennsylvania. Hey, Paul.
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to follow up on the comments on Howard Schultz, the Starbucks executive now, current multi-billionaire.
Yeah.
He was interviewed about launching his campaign, and I couldn't believe the dim-witted comments that were coming out of his mouth. He immediately started to attack the Medicare for All, which is, obviously has a big tidal wave of support sweeping across the Democratic Party.
Right.
So he mustering, I guess, as much energy as you can as a guy without a care in the world because of his fortune. He says, well, they're abolishing an entire industry.
Right.
What industry will they abolish next? The coffee business?
How about the buggy whip industry? Times change. Come on.
This is the same person who you will see at the Davos interviews on a business channel saying, well, Amazon is just, rationalizing and consolidating itself. The fact that all the independent booksellers were abolished by capitalism. Capitalism abolishes business. Walmart disembowels small towns' commercial districts. I mean,
no, this
honestly,
is the cancer stage of capitalism, Paul. There's no doubt about that. This is what we're
well,
witnessing.
not only that, they have a word for it. The great economist called it, destructive, creative destruction. I mean,
Right.
capitalism on a periodic basis wipes out entire industries. Try buying a typewriter.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right. But, like I said, to a certain extent, that's like with the buggy whip industry, that's just like, things change. But the question that we should be, what we really should be debating with the Howard Schultz candidacy is, or the potential of one, what we really should be debating is predatory business models. Starbucks, a large chunk of their business model appears to be putting small independent coffee stores out of business. Is that something we want to encourage in America? I mean, this has been the business model since the 80s. This is what Walmart pioneered. Put local businesses out of business and do it by whatever means necessary. And certainly, under Howard Schultz's supervision, Starbucks has turned that into, an art form. So, let's have a discussion, an actual debate about the Starbucks business model. I'm all in favor of that. Paul, thanks for the call. Excellent points all. And very well said. We'll be back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. We're going to check in with Bob Ney at Talk Media News and find out what's up in the world. We'll be right back. Just did a rant about how we have actually passed a major climate change tipping point that we can't walk back from. We can't stop it. This is coming now. It is unstoppable. This first step of it, which has to do with, the destruction of major cities in the United States and all around the world. You can check this out over at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, or for people who support us on YouTube as well, you can see this. Get over to patreon.com/THOMHARTMANN to check this out. We're talking about how prior to a couple of years ago, and this is how, tipping points, you can only see them in the rearview mirror. Prior to a couple of years ago, in the winter, the Arctic and Greenland, the Antarctic and Greenland would recover some of their ice. Now they're not even doing that. It's just pausing. The melting is just pausing. That's that tipping point. And the consequences of this are going to be terrible. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So let's check in with Bob Ney at Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com. And loving what you do, Ellen Ratner's new book on the line with us, the author of Sideswiped, the true story of what happens in the U.S. House of Representatives. Former Congressman Bob Ney. Bob, welcome back to the program. What's going on in the world today?
Well, thank you, Tom. Before I get to the news, can I make one comment? Your caller talked about Wilbur Ross.
Yeah.
He had a company called the ICG, International Coal Group, and he stripped first $267 million in personal windfall out of the health care benefits of some steel workers.
Wow.
As you know, I'm from the Appalachia area and had a district down there in the 18th Congressional Right. Well, he also acquired the Sago Mine, and it was 100 miles east of Charleston, West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a non-union operation. It racked up safety violations from federal inspectors, 208 in 2005 alone. And then that year, the roof of the mine collapsed 20 times, and the workers at Sago were injured 3 times as often as workers in any other coal mine in America. He claimed not to be part of the management group and later admitted he was aware of the violations and waived them. Then in January of the next year, methane ignited in the mine. And so I just wanted to mention that. There's what that caller talked about. There's extreme details that are horrific.
So that Sago mine disaster that I have a recollection of, a whole bunch of miners died, didn't they? That was in a mine owned by Wilbur Ross?
He was part of what was called and see, this has never had attention. We know from the coal area because, Trump and Hillary Clinton and coal, et cetera.
Yeah.
But he had $1.2 billion in coal assets through his company called the International Coal Group. And one of his company, ICG's acquisitions, was the Sago Mine.
Amazing.
He was involved in that acquisition. And a lot of people just don't know those dots are deeply connected. Your caller's talking about him. And he claimed to not be part of the operating management of Sago, although they had the acquisition of it. He later admitted publicly he was aware of the violations, and he waived them, 208 in 2005 alone.
That's astonishing. That's astonishing.
Then they had the methane. It ignited a deep explosion. It instantly killed a worker, stranded a dozen others, and it was about 2 miles from the mouth of the mine. It had carbon dioxide. It was filled with it.
Right. This is where they had to drill a hole down and free the miners.
I just wanted to say.
So this is all Wilbur Ross's fault. Yeah, we're trying to figure out who's the worst member of the cabinet. Is is it the former oil lobbyist who's now running Interior? Is it the former coal lobbyist who's now running the EPA? Is it the lobbyist for private schools, Betsy DeVos, who in her home state of Michigan now more than half the schools in Michigan are charter schools? She's destroyed public education in Michigan. Is it David Bernhardt? Go ahead.
No, it's tough.
Or is it Alex Azar?
Where I'm from. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Alex Azar, the drug company lobbyist who's running Health and Human Services. I mean, you got 4 or 5 lobbyists in the Trump cabinet. It's insane. Anyhow, Bob, what's going on in the world?
Oh, yes, sir. I think the real story of the day is the fact that, the president is angry, and it's almost as if the head of the intelligence agencies that serve in his cabinet were hand-selected by Nancy Pelosi and not by him, if you would see how he's acting on this, his anger level. He selected them. They are his cabinet officials. And after the testimony, of course, with Dan Coates is the one that he was most angry about. And if you look at the ISIS statement that the president said on December 19th of last year that the U.S. troops would withdraw from Syria, and then President Trump declared that, quote, we've won against ISIS, we've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. Then, yet, of course, in the testimony, Coates said, quote, ISIS is intent on resurging and still commands thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria. But I think the most telling disagreement with the president is what Coates said about Iran, because, of course, the president said that it's clear, and this was last year, it's clear that we cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement, meaning President Obama, of course, in the Iran nuclear deal, which President Trump undid, which, of course, his original first Secretary of State, Tillerson, did not want to undo. And then he got rid of him, then he undid the deal.
Right.
And so on Tuesday, it was testified by Coates, quote, we do not believe Iran is currently undertaking the key activities we judge necessary to produce a nuclear device. And so I think that the reason this is the most telling, and we've been talking to some people in D.C. about this, and even some conservative Republican senators are coming out saying the president ought to listen to his intel people. And, of course, Chuck Schumer made the comment that he needs an intervention by his, his intel directors and his intel chief.
I think he does.
And because, especially with the Iran deal, because, as we know, John Bolton has publicly wanted to nuke Iran, then he had his really ridiculous little incident this week where he held his notepad up accidentally so that the press corps could see that, it says send 5,000 troops to Colombia. It's just completely staged. So the disagreement is telling, though, that the President of the United States doesn't agree with any of his intel chiefs.
Yeah, and at the same time, he's surrounded himself with crazies like, Bolton and Pompeo, guys who have a long history of just extremist pro-war comments. It's insane.
Absolutely.
Bob Ney, author of Sideswipe. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Robin Marty. It's titled Handbook for a Post-Roe, as in Roe v. Wade, for a Post-Roe America. And the cut line on the front says, the future without Roe is coming straight at us. This is the roadmap you need for the tough times ahead. This is from Chapter 7, page 101, titled Knowing Your Comfort Zone, Why Civil Disobedience. Access to abortion and birth control isn't just a health care issue and an economic issue, it's also a civil rights issue. And like every civil rights battle, gains are made through acts of civil disobedience or working outside the legal framework. Married people officially gained the right to access birth control only after Estelle Griswold, the executive director of the Planned Parenthood League of Connecticut, opened a clinic and began offering contraception in direct opposition to the 1960s state law forbidding it. That right was extended to single people in 1972 after Bill Baird was arrested in 1967 for purposely flaunting the Massachusetts law and publicly providing contraceptives to an unmarried woman during a college lecture. The Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion spent much of the 1960s and early 70s prior to the Roe decision, assisting pregnant people in finding safe abortions either from legal or illegal providers throughout the country and across the borders. And there were groups like Jane's Collective that provided the service themselves, even at the risk of their own arrest. Today, people are highlighting a number of issues through acts of civil disobedience. North Carolina had weekly mass arrests at their state capitol during Moral Mondays protests, while the Black Lives Matter movement physically closed highways with their bodies. And of course, when Brett Kavanaugh was appointed to the Supreme Court, hundreds of activists were arrested, some multiple times, for interrupting his hearings, protesting in the Hart Building when it became clear the Senate Judiciary was not going to investigate claims of past sexual assault. Some protesters even blocked the stairs prior to Kavanaugh's swearing-in ceremony. As our society recedes further into racism, sexism, xenophobia, and classism, opposing the power structure through nonviolent means grows more imperative. Aaron Mattson, the co-founder of the reproductive rights group Repro Action in Teen Vogue, wrote, "If Roe is overturned or gutted, it is certain that some states will propose and enact some abortion bans, new abortion bans. Again, nonviolent civil disobedience should remain on the table, this time targeting state and municipal level lawmakers. We must remember that while in several contexts abortion rights supporters lack immediate political power, in spite of the fact that nearly 7 in 10 Americans do not want to see Roe overturned, we always retain the power of using our bodies to stop or slow the machinery of state repression." End of quote. Mattson adds, ultimately, it's up to activists to decide. Are we willing to break convention if lobbying fails? Are we willing to strategically expose ourselves to the risks of arrest? And if we are not, are we willing to look into the eyes of the future generations who will be incarcerated for abortions, miscarriages, and pregnancy complications? End of quote. Repro Action is a growing network of state-based activists that conducts political events, teach-ins, and other direct actions to increased access to abortion and birth control services. They currently have national campaigns as well as individual campaigns in D.C., Virginia, Missouri, Arkansas, and Wisconsin. You can join up with or financially support Repro Action to increase their national and local reach. Subchapter title, Is Civil Disobedience Right for Me? What are you willing to do to make sure that you, the people you know, or even total strangers have access to contraception and abortion care, especially once more abortion options become illegal? Are you willing to be arrested if you participate in direct action or nonviolent protest? Is helping someone obtain abortion pills worth a potential prison sentence? Would you drive a teen to another state to get an abortion if that drive makes you an abortion facilitator and thus a federal criminal? You may believe you're willing to risk everything to help someone get an abortion, and that may well be what is needed in some cases in a post-Roe America. But make sure that you've really thought out all the consequences of such a radical approach. These are the questions you should be asking yourself now before new laws are put into place. One small silver lining of the Trump era is the way it has energized so many people to actively resist the political agenda. There are more activists, donors, candidates, and protesters than there have been in decades. And that means lots of people who can work together and step in when and where people are needed. But in certain geographic areas, it is and will continue to be harder to find those with the ability and privilege to do resistance work. For example, with the Trump administration's increasing militarization of ICE and border security, checkpoints into and out of America will be more scrutinized than ever before. With a population that in many cases is literally trapped in places like the Rio Grande Valley or Las Cruces, where undocumented people can neither leave the country for services nor go further into the U.S. for care, the need for additional action and people who have the willingness and ability to act may be greater than in New York City or the Bay Area. Maybe you have a very specific skill set. You might be medically trained, have a legal background, or maybe you've done counseling or social work, or you're a member of the clergy. These are people who will add a lot of value to the movement, especially if it turns out civil disobedience is the right way to proceed. Ask yourself if you're the only person who can do the thing you're considering doing, or if there's a number of people like you who are planning to step up. Then ask yourself what sort of risk you may be running and how those factors balance out. It's almost impossible to be a solitary activist these days, but there are spaces where you can manage. Letter writing campaigns, social media campaigns, information distribution, and fundraising can all be accomplished in a fairly solitary environment. Handbook for a Post-Roe America. Those folks who support our program, who help essentially sponsor us on YouTube and on Patreon, have access to content, special content that is generally not available on YouTube or anyplace else. In exchange for supporting us at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, you get the whole 3-hour show, a video podcast that's not available to the general public, that you can watch anytime you want for every single show every day, plus special content that is not available anywhere else. The rant this week, 200,000 Americans have died from overdoses involving prescription opioids since 1996. So the question, what do we do with a company and the individuals who own that company and run that company that has been directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 Americans? What do we do? We've got a serious problem with an out-of-control pharmaceutical industry in the United States, and we need and product liability in general. We need to do something about it.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the program, to the third hour of our program. Today, actually yesterday, we do a book report every day, or a new one every day. They kind of add up, and on our nonprofit stream and on Free Speech TV, they play while our commercial stations are doing the news at the top of the hour. And the book report that we rolled out yesterday was Handbook for a Post-Roe America by Robin Marty. I think Katha Pollitt's blurb on the front cover, "The future without Roe is coming straight at us. This is a roadmap you need for the tough times ahead," is a really great summary of the book. And I thought it was just a marvelous book. And I wanted to get Robin on to talk about this book, the Handbook for a Post-Roe, ROE, as in Roe v. Wade, America. The book is from Seven Stories Press. And Robin Marty's Twitter handle is Robin, M-A-R-T-Y. Robin, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tom.
It's great having you with us. So tell us, how certain are you that this particular Supreme Court is going to overturn Roe v. Wade? Or is it that the individual states are taking actions right now that are functionally doing that and nobody is stopping them, so we don't even need the Supreme Court to screw it up?
Well, I would say that the states are functionally stopping abortion from being accessible for the most part, but I do believe that this Supreme Court will overturn Roe v. Wade. I would suspect that the actual overturning would happen as late as, or as soon as after the next presidential election. I do not think that they will overturn it before 2020 because they know that if that happens, there is no way they would keep the White House. But I do believe that after that has settled, that yes, Roe will be overturned.
That's amazing. So what will that mean for women in states like California or New York, where abortion is still available, or in states like Louisiana, where it's very, very difficult to access abortion?
Right. So we're going to have a patchwork, even more so than we already have, of states that will primarily be either on the east or west coast, and then basically Colorado and Illinois, where abortion will be legal and accessible and people will be able to get it. And then for the rest of the country, we'll see at least 15 states that will have abortion completely illegal, and then probably another 15 to 20 where abortion will be mostly illegal, and you will only be able to access it at maybe 1 or 2 clinics in the state, and probably in as little as 6 to 12 weeks.
Isn't the functional outcome of that going to be that we are reverting back to the pre-Roe standard, essentially, of wealthier women, upper middle class and wealthier women can easily access abortion. Women who don't have access to money basically can't. I remember being in high school, I remember one girl in particular who was in my high school who I didn't know particularly well, but one day she just stopped coming to school, and we later learned that she had died. She had had a back alley abortion and became septic and got an infection and literally just died in one day. And on the other hand, I remember a couple of different people that I knew, and this was back in the 60s, right? This was the late 60s, who had what were called DNCs. They would go in, they would say, and the excuse was I was having hard periods. And so they go in for this process where they basically scrape out the inside of the uterus. And in fact, usually the DNCs being done in the 60s were actually early stage abortions. And, if you could afford to go to the hospital and have a DNC, no problem. Is that the kind of thing we're going to go back to, or is it going to be even worse than that?
Well, see, I would argue that we're already there right now. For many of the states in the U.S., especially in the southern portion of the U.S. and along the Gulf, we only have one, maybe two abortion clinics in each of those states. They're very overfilled with patients. Abortion is still a fairly expensive procedure that a lot of people cannot obtain. So we are seeing people who already are living in states where abortion access is just for the white and for the wealthy. In some ways, I actually believe that having Roe overturned might benefit the country, because when abortion is completely illegal in these states, and then it is difficult even for those of privilege and those with money to be able to access, then people will see the real live impact of what it's like when there is no access to abortion. Once it affects everyone, then I think that everybody will start to go ahead and gather together and do more political force to make sure that abortion becomes legal once more.
Speaking of this strategically, we used to have conversations, debates about abortion on this program, for years, obviously. I mean, it's a hot topic. It's been a hotter topic in the past. But Phyllis Schlafly used to come on this show a lot, and she, of course, yeah, I get it. And she and I actually agree on a couple of things that have to do with the Supreme Court, which has made for some fascinating conversations. The argument that she made against Roe v. Wade, though, I thought was actually a fascinating argument. I'd love to get your take on it. What she said essentially was that the birth control pill was legalized in 61, or was brought to market in 61. By 63, 64, birth control pills were widely available all across the United States. And that produced the so-called sexual revolution, women coming into the workplace because, in larger numbers, all these kind of things were happening. And that by 73, the trend line was very strongly in favor of individual states legalizing abortion. And in fact, it was starting to happen. And a debate was starting to break out in individual states about, do we legalize abortion or not in this state? And that when the Supreme Court stepped in with Roe v. Wade and simply legalized abortion nationwide with a very specific criteria, the first 3 months, the second 3 months, the third, these trimesters, that essentially, her argument was, A, they were making law, and I don't think that we can dispute that, coming up with the 3 trimesters. That's what a legislature is supposed to do. And B, the court has there's no constitutional basis for that. And B, by short-circuiting that legislative process around the country, they shut down the conversation and they empowered the radicalized portion of the anti-abortion movement in a way that nothing else could have empowered them, and delayed, in fact, by generations, a healthy legislative process that would have this debate, this discussion that you and I are having. What do you think about that?
Not to be rude, but that's totally wrong.
Okay. All right.
So to start with, the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade did not come up with the trimester system. That was in Planned Parenthood v. Casey in '92. And the trimester system says that abortion should be accessible for any reason in the first trimester. In the second trimester, the state's decisions to try and promote fetal life should be able to put in restrictions as long as those restrictions did not make an undue burden and were in the benefit of the health of the person who is trying to obtain the procedure. Roe v. Wade essentially said that until the point of fetal viability, which at that point was considered around 28, 29 weeks, that abortion was legal and up to the person who was going to have one. After that, abortion would only be legal in cases where a person's physical or mental health were in distress. And so a provider decided that that was in the person's best interest to go ahead and obtain an abortion. So we tend to get these mixed up. And
yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately when you look at the fight that's going on right now in New York, the huge brouhaha that just happened in Virginia over the idea of all of these bills in Virginia, in New York, in New Mexico, all they are trying to do is codify the protections of Roe v. Wade because they believe that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. So they are using the exact same framework as the courts decided in Roe v. Wade, which is that until the point of viability, it is up to the person who is going to decide to have an abortion. And then after the point of viability, it's available for health reasons, physical or mental. All they are doing is codifying Roe v. Wade. Now, if abortion opponents really believed what they've been saying for the last 30 years, which is that they don't want to stop abortion per se, they just want to send it back to the states, then they would be letting these states make these decisions. But instead, they're making up all sorts of asinine discussions about how people are saying that these new laws will allow doctors to abort children at the point of crowning, and it's infanticide and all of that. And I think they're really showing exactly how they really don't believe that, no, states should not decide. All they want and all they've ever wanted is complete illegality for all abortion from the point of fertilization. And that's where they're going to keep going. Everything else is just smoke screens that they throw up.
Now, Pat Buchanan used to speak out loudly about this, and the subtext that I got from his writings and rants, and he'd been on our show back more than a decade ago about this, was that basically he was opposed to abortions among white people. He didn't care about abortions among people of color. Is there a large sector of the anti-abortion movement that is also concerned about what Buchanan referred to as the white genocide?
I would say no. I spend a lot of time with anti-abortion people. I go to their conferences, I go to their marches, I spend time with them in front of clinics. For the most part, they are all extraordinarily sincere. They believe that life begins at the moment of fertilization, and anything that a person does in order to try and disrupt that is playing God. And that's what it all comes down to for them. Now, we are starting to see more of a right-wing white nationalist influence into a lot of the abortion movement. And I think that there have been a number of, especially Christian nationalists, who have kind of combined this white power feeling of, okay, we want to make sure that white babies are saved into it, because there's a common ground there in making sure that babies are saved. But I don't think that overall the majority of the movement cares about what race they're saving. They just want to save their babies.
Fascinating stuff. Robin Marty is the author. The book is Handbook for a Post-Roe, as in ROE, Roe v. Wade, a Post-Roe America. Robin, brilliant work, brilliant writing. Thanks for educating me today, and I appreciate your being on.
Thanks for having me on, Tom. Anytime.
My pleasure. You can tweet Robin at Robin Marty, ROBIN-MARTY. We'll be back with more of the program in just a moment. It's 17 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So who is the worst member of the Trump cabinet? I didn't know about Sago Mine and Wilbur Ross. This is pretty mind-boggling. And more after this. And welcome back. Let's see here. Patrick in Los Angeles. Hey, Patrick, what's on your mind today?
Tom, thanks for letting me on here. Really appreciate it. By the way, the whole cabinet, they're a group of deplorables. So
yeah,
I can't give you one person. But I was going to disagree with the use of socialism. You had somebody call up and asking about how to defend that. And to be honest with you, socialism is the new communism. And because whenever they
meaning in terms of boogeyman, I mean, is that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a boogeyman. And when you think about it, communism never really existed because the Soviet Union, they were a dictatorship. China was a dictatorship. Cuba was a dictatorship. They never operated as communist countries. And
no, you want socialism, go to Sweden.
Well, yeah. There's no need to defend that term, because if America wants Social Security or single-payer health care or Medicare or fire department or police department or whatever, if they want that, then that's just called democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So why anybody is even using that term is beyond me. There's no need to defend it. It's the new boogeyman. It's the argument that doesn't need to be made.
Yeah.
It's just democracy. It's America acting as a democratic republic.
Yeah.
What is?
Well, and I think this is why so many young people right now are embracing the word socialism. You know, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is long gone. China is no longer calling it a socialist, itself a socialist state, although they do still use the word communist. But socialism, I think most Americans who are paying attention to this conversation recognize that socialism is what you see in Northern Europe. And in fact, arguably all across Europe, and in fact in Canada, and Mexico with single-payer healthcare systems. What's particularly bizarre to me, Patrick, is the Fox News meme that it has been picked up by right-wing hate radio in a big way in the last couple of years, which is that the National Socialists, which is the first two letters of the word Nazi, N-A-Z-I, the National Socialists of Germany were socialists. And, yes, Hitler, liked the national health care program, but that was put into place by Bismarck in like 1881, as I recall. And Hitler said, yes, you can have a labor union, but you can only have one, and I run it. I mean, it was a right-wing dictatorship that used the word socialism because everybody loved that word. And but it's amazing to me, Patrick, how many right-wingers, they still call into this show all the time and go, oh, yeah, you want socialism? That's Hitler. I don't get it.
But you know what, Tom? The average American doesn't pay attention to the conversation. The use of the word democratic socialism is understandable by you and I because we have a brain.
Yeah.
But a knuckle-dragger, or, to be honest with you, America is not a smart country. And most people don't know these things. They don't understand them. They don't try to understand them.
Well, our work, Patrick, then is to help make America become a smart country. I mean, you can't have, you can't have an educated, you can't have a functioning democracy without an educated populace. It's just like...
For 2 years is not enough time.
Yeah. Well, we've got a hell of a big job here. Patrick, thank you for the call. And let's get started. It's 21 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day right after this. Stick around. So would you like to watch the Thom Hartmann program, all 3 hours of our program, anytime you'd like? It's available. Would you like to hear special content where we talk about, what the billionaires are up to, or climate change, or the newest things in science? There's all kinds of great content like that. That's also available. The place to find all this is the Thom Hartmann channel over on Patreon. Patreon.com, Patreon.com. /Thom Hartmann, THOMHARTMANN, all run together. Patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. And there, when you become a supporter of the program through Patreon, you have access to the full 3-hour show every day, anytime you want, any place you want, and special content that we put up every single week that is unique specifically to our Patreon page. So check it out.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thanks for supporting our program. Welcome back. Otis in Yorktown, Virginia. Do I have that right, or is that Virgin Islands?
Yorktown, Virginia, Tom. How you doing?
Great. What's up, Otis?
I'll start with this. I learned in the 6th grade the hardest person to educate is the person who's been indoctrinated.
Yeah.
Then I want to tell you, as far as worst cabinet member, if you go with the guy that did Whitefish, or you go with Mnuchin, who did the One West predatory foreclosures, or you do Ross, who was a cable baron. I happen to be a missileer, and one of my friends now is in a steel company, and he actually told me that story. But I tell you this, it's really the vice president. He lets the carnival barker, Trump, do what he's doing, and he, Mr. Pence, is running the whole show of a totally deplorable cabinet put together by Rebecca and Robert Mercer. I don't think you can pick any one. Once we get 10 years out, we're going to find out there was so much damage done to the total breadth of government until there's going to be like Dick Cheney, who ran Bush II's cabinet.
Right, and Dick Cheney, took us into Iraq and Afghanistan because he so wanted the war, and Halliburton was on the verge of bankruptcy when Cheney left Halliburton to become vice president. And, of course, Halliburton is now worth billions because Cheney gave them all those no-bid contracts as a consequence of the war in Iraq. He loved it.
Can I finish with one other thing?
Sure.
I actually sit underground at the Titan II missile silo, and the guy I'm telling you about worked maintenance. One thing that we talked about in the 70s, and that was the Titan II, the largest missile in the arsenal. And we talked about this, and I'm ashamed that I'm alive long enough to
10 seconds, Otis.
That they'd come up with limited nuclear strike weapons.
Yes.
That's the worst idea ever.
Well, that's what Trump is promoting right now.
That's why I brought it up.
These low-yield battlefield nukes. I mean, that's absolutely what Trump is promoting right now. Otis, thanks a lot for the call. Jim in Pine City, Minnesota. Hey, Jim, what's up?
Hi, Tom. A couple things. You're talking about Sweden. We have a foreign exchange student coming back to visit us when our boys were seniors in high school. He's coming in a couple of days from northern Sweden. But so we're looking for that.
Yeah.
My question is, when Trump got elected, I invested pretty heavily into precious metals, gold, silver, and platinum. And yesterday, the broker I bought from sent an email, and it was a long video about J.P. Morgan buying over 95% of all available silver. And I'm wondering what that could
You're
do.
talking about back in the 20s?
No, just now.
Oh, J.P. Morgan, the bank.
Yes, J.P. Morgan, the bank.
I would be very surprised by that. That's, the Hunt brothers tried that back in the 80s, cornering the silver market, and didn't work out so well for them.
Okay.
So just because somebody sends you a video or, a YouTube link or something, or even a web link,
Well, this was the company I bought my precious metals from.
Well, it's possible. I mean, but Jim, I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't respond to it. I just don't know. Tim in Bend, Oregon. Hey, Tim, got a quick one here? Just a little less than a minute to the break.
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to say that what scares me about the Howard Schultz presidential run is I think it's a shot across the bow on the Democrats to make them nominate a more moderate candidate.
Yeah. Oh, I agree, and there's an enormous amount of pressure. Anybody who thinks that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, on the one hand, and Kamala Harris and I need a list of candidates, but Cory Booker and any of the others, frankly, all the rest of the candidates are the same thing is sadly mistaken. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are pursuing an actual inquiry into the fate and future of this capitalist system that we have and the power of corporations in our democracy. None of the other candidates are talking about that. They are instead talking about, well, yeah, sure, we'll give you health care for all. I think that we really need to recognize this. Tim, thanks for the call.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And I absolutely agree with you that Howard Schultz's so-called candidacy is probably an attempt to push the Democratic Party to the right. And it may, we'll see if it's successful or not. For our book club today, we're reading from a book that's long out of print, The History of World War II, Armed Services Memorial Edition. It's written by Francis Trevelyan Miller and the U.S. military, and with the Board of Historical and Military Authorities by Universal Book and Bible House in 1945. And this is from the chapter, The Phenomenon of Hitler. It starts out, His father was Alois Schicklgruber, the illegitimate child of a peasant girl who bore his mother's name until he was 40. Alois started out as a shoemaker's apprentice. Conscripted into the army, he rose to the rank of sergeant. That was so much above a mere cobbler, he stayed with the army for 15 years. After his discharge, he received a so-called certificate appointment that made him a minor customs official with the Imperial Civil Service. He had worked up to what seemed to him high above the scorned class of common people, the peasants, and the poor little working men. That trait had its influence on his son, Adolf. Alois Schicklgruber married 3 times. His first wife, 14 years older than he, divorced him. While his first marriage was still valid, another girl, Franziska Matzelsberger, bore him a son, Alois. Schicklgruber married her after his divorced wife died. 2 months after their marriage, she bore him a daughter, Angela. 1 year later, his second wife died. 10 months thereafter, he married Clara Polzel, who was his junior by 23 years. He was 47 then and had in the meantime changed his name to obtain a legacy to Hitler. From his third marriage sprang 5 children, of whom 3 died in infancy. The 2 surviving were Adolf and Paula. Adolf Hitler's half-brother, Alois, ran away from home, complaining about cruel treatment by his father. He worked as a waiter in England, married an Irish girl, treated her cruelly, and begot a son, William Patrick Hitler. After Adolf came to power, Alois returned to Germany, leaving wife and son behind, and became a prosperous innkeeper. Adolf's half-sister, Angela, also followed him to Germany from Austria to care for his households in Munich and Berchtesgaden. She was the mother of unhappy Gel Rubal, the girl who is said to have committed suicide after becoming enamored of her uncle Adolf. His sister Paula, considered a queer person, lived a troublesome life in Vienna and became an ardent Nazi. William Patrick Hitler broke away from the Hitler clan and came with his mother to the United States to fight against the world scourge of Nazism. This young man, imbued with the spirit of freedom inherited from his liberty-loving Irish mother, joined the United States Navy. The historians of this volume held confidential talks with Hitler's nephews, some of which can be related here. He placed before us official documents which threw light on the background of Adolf Hitler. He told us about the years when he lived with his uncle at Berchtesgaden, the conduct and habits of the Führer, how in his mountain retreat, the most strongly fortified in the world, Hitler planned and plotted world conquest. The nephew related to us the secrets of the mysterious Rudolf Hess and the Ernst Putzi Hofstadtgegel, who fled to England, the latter being held prisoner in Canada and later coming to the United States. Letters were submitted to document the facts. These are books in themselves, which undoubtedly will be revealed in future years. It is sufficient to state here that young Patrick Hitler fled from Berchtesgaden when he became convinced that his uncle, Adolf, was suffering from delusions of grandeur and a messianic complex which endangered his own nephew's life as well as Germany and the whole world. Having disposed of 1,000 of his intimates, Adolf Hitler's own family was not safe from attack. He would break into his nephew's room in the midnight hours to rant about how he would conquer the world. As a child, he was as difficult as Alois, his father. Father Alois was a tyrannical egoist with a mania for cruelty. Young Adolf liked to rage in rabid oratories, audience or no audience. His father called him daffy and lazy. He wanted his son to become an important personage like himself. But 11-year-old Adolf revolted against going to school and exposing himself to the heavy task of book learning. He hated his teachers, he hated his schoolmates. Faced by the odious realities of life as they were fearfully represented to him by a father with a big stick and an inclination for alcohol, Adolf wanted only to escape. He was 13 at the time of his father's death and 19 when his mother died. Of the 6 years between those two events, little is known about the boy's doings, except that he prevailed upon his mother to take him out of the hated secondary school, and that she encouraged him in his hobby of making drawings until his ego became inflated to the point that he believed himself a genius. He lived on his mother's pension until her death. With his mother and her income gone, the escapist days were over. He had to face life. A misfit, uneducated, arrogant, undeveloped in mind, stubborn and quarrelsome, without any moral concepts. Such was young Adolf Hitler when he entered Vienna in the beginning of 1909. Here his ego was deflated for the first time. He could not even pass his entrance exams to the Academy of Arts. His drawings were considered crude imitations, counterfeits. When a jury at the Academy of Munich refused a painting he submitted for exhibition, he stormed back to inquire who composed the jury. He learned that among them was a Jew who ranked as one of the outstanding masters of German art. At once, he blamed the jury's decision to exclude his work upon this Jew, declaring, "They shall pay for this." Precipitated from vainglory, Hitler woke to find himself an obscure outcast. In his despair, he stooped so low in his own estimation as to take up work as an unskilled laborer. To carry mortar on scaffolding was far beneath his dignity. He had not yet conceived the idea that Providence had chose him to be the leader of the master race. The history of World War II.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
It's 34 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. How do we stop giving America away to billionaires and big corporations? We started the program with this back 2.5 hours ago. And I think it's a really important point. The Foxconn plant in Wisconsin, Foxconn, I'm thinking that they actually never even intended to build a manufacturing plant there. They just wanted Wisconsin to give them hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's going to take, it may take an act of Congress to not have Wisconsin have to pay these guys. And it's like, I'm saying any state that within that state offers giant tax breaks to corporations to move to that state versus any other state should lose their federal highway funds. We need to put a stop to this right now. Boeing played this game. Walmart plays this game every time they cite a new store. It's time to say no. It's time to stop this kind of stuff. And I think we need to do this. Dr. Richard Wolff pointed out or agreed with me that Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve is now groveling at the feet of Donald Trump, thus setting up an enormous financial crash in 2020, right after a Democrat is elected president in November of 2020. I frankly think that this is how the Republicans are trying to organize this. We'll see in 2 years if I'm prescient or not. I just don't think it's rocket science to look at this and say that's what they're doing. Mitch McConnell says that H.R. 1, the bill that would make it, that would require some transparency on billionaire contributions to politicians, is a power grab by Democrats. That's pretty much giving away the store. That's pretty much obvious. In other words, Mitch McConnell is admitting right up front that if it wasn't for dark money coming from billionaires, the Republican Party would be toast. And then Robin Marty talking about a post-Roe America. I mean, some serious stuff here. Ross in Windsor Locks, Connecticut. Hey, Ross, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the president has already declared a national emergency, and nobody said anything about it. Now,
there are 30 of them in effect right now.
Pardon?
There are over 30 national emergency declarations in effect right now. Some of them date back decades, but I'm not sure if Trump has signed any of them, but and every single one of them, by the way, adds to the power that the president has.
Well, this is the one I'm thinking of. The end of the year when he denied all federal workers.
He denied all federal what?
He denied all federal workers their raise.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, he did that like December 28th to 29th last year.
And he did that based on declaring a state of emergency?
And I think that he was able to do that. They had a contracted raise, and he denied them that raise, which was supposed to be 2 or 3%, and he declared a national emergency to do that.
Huh. Ross, I'm going to have to look into it. I don't know. And maybe somebody listening knows, but and there's also different levels of national emergency depending on what part of the law, what emergency provision he's pointing to. Whether declaring an emergency in order to stiff federal contract workers gives him additional presidential powers with things like war-making powers or tax-making powers or the ability to call out the National Guard or the ability to shut down the internet in a particular town or whatever. Whether that that little statement gives him those big powers or whether he needs to make a really big statement to get those big powers, I don't know. That's something
Okay, this wasn't contract workers. These were actual
federal employees. Yeah, same. But my point is still the same. Whether that was, whether the level of emergency involved in that gives him those powers that, over at the Brennan Center, they wrote that extraordinary piece. It's like 20 pages long. I printed it out yesterday of all the powers that Trump would get if he declared a full-blown national emergency. I'm guessing that's much more limited than that, Russ. But this is something that we need to do a little more research on. Russ, thanks a lot for the call. Rick in Lexington, Kentucky. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind today?
Thanks, Tom, for taking my call. I'm pretty frustrated, and you're my security blanket, so I just have a question.
Okay. What's up?
At what point do you believe that the Trump supporter and the Trump voter should be held accountable? And I look at a lot of cable news, and basically they treat this, our whole situation and our democracy like it's some kind of sporting event.
Yeah.
And,
well, so does the media.
They want to pit one against the other.
Yeah. The media is doing the same thing, though, Rick.
I'm frustrated over that. My question to you, though, is just basically, at what point in time do we say, okay, people who voted for Trump and still support him, there's something wrong with them? And I mean, we live in America. You have a right to vote for whoever you want to. But the bottom line is that if you're a supporter of his 2 years into this, and you don't see that there was a mistake made, something's wrong.
Well, here's the question, Rick. I agree with you, and right across the board. The question, though, is if you're going to hold Trump voters accountable, what's the mechanism of that accountability? There's a fascinating piece, I think it was in today's Washington.
Whoa. That you come on TV and you talk about them in a legitimate manner. That basically, if you can stand behind, I'm a black man. If I can stand behind Trump and he's a racist and a bigot, then there's something wrong with me. If you can stand behind Trump and he's against voter suppression, he put kids in cages. If you can find justification for standing behind that kind of
So Rick, what you're saying is call people out, and I get this, and I do this every single day, I think. But the point that I was making about this piece in the Washington Post is that what they're saying is that those people in America whose income is going down, whose access to government services like Medicare or Medicaid rather, or food stamps is going down, those people who are sliding into deeper and deeper poverty and misery are the people who are the most likely to vote for Trump. And those states that are embracing expansion of Medicaid, those states that are raising their minimum wages, those states that are actively improving the quality of life of their citizens, those are the states that are most likely not to be supportive of Trump, but rather to be supportive of Democrats. So in a way, Trump supporters are already, facing a reckoning. They just don't realize it.
Tom, I live in Kentucky. My senators are Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul. Every time I think about that, I upchuck a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? The bottom line is what you just described was welcome to people of color.
Yeah.
We've lived this life my whole life, hoping things were going to get better. You're going to tell me because white people are dealing with some injustice now, are wondering, wow, it's tough being white, that justifies Trump?
No, I'm not. What I'm saying, Rick, is that that's what's happening. And you're absolutely right, and this has been the life of people of color forever in this country, and it's been much worse than this, in fact. But the simple reality is that because the majority of this country is white, because the power structure of this country is white, because the media is entirely owned and run by white people by and large, and mostly that's what you see in the media, when white people start to experience pain, that's when you're going to see a media response, and that's when you're going to see a governmental response.
So that's what I'm asking you. When are Trump supporters going to be held accountable?
My question to you, Rick, is what is the mechanism of that accountability? How do you hold them accountable, other than maybe pointing out to them, these white Trump supporters, that they are shooting themselves in the foot, that they're hurting themselves?
The civil rights movement. How did you do it when black people were getting dogs let on, getting beat up by the police? How did you do it?
Well, they were not, by and large, the civil rights movement was not so much holding white people accountable, because I don't recall, Sheriff Connor going to prison. Instead, what it was doing was opening opportunities for people of color to have a place in society. The accountability has never been a piece of this equation, Rick, because the white power structure does not like accountability for white people.
What basically happened was there were enough white people in this country that got tired of seeing black people get beat up on TV, dogs let out on them, people being just treated like animals to where they hit their morality button.
You're absolutely right.
We're better than this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But again, I don't, I love your idea. Let's hold Trump voters accountable. I love that idea. I just don't know how to do it other than pointing out that, these people are rubes and shills, and, that they're being conned, that they're hurting themselves. I mean, there's all that. But you can't raise their taxes. They're not probably, most of them are not, making enough to pay taxes. You can't, there's no legal recourse against them. What is the mechanism of that accountability? That's my question to you, Rick.
Tom. The one mechanism is quit coming on cable news and calling Republicans, conservatives, evangelicals. Every time you think about that, say white people.
Yeah. But again, you're talking about
using that excuse. Say white people and say it on TV so white people can't run from it.
No, I get it. And I'm with you, Rick. But that's not a mechanism of accountability. That's calling out the power structure, and I'm all in favor of that. Rick, I'm running out of time here. Thank you for the call. If anybody else has a suggestion about how to hold Trump voters accountable, I'd love to hear it. Sean in North Platte, Nebraska. Hey, Sean, what's up?
Hey, I have it was like I heard your two callers talk about using the word socialism. Well, I've used it. It's like I was sitting at a tire place getting my tire fixed on my pickup, and some guys made some comments about my Bernie stickers, and I'm like, well, my house was the Bernie Sanders headquarters, and they made a comment about socialism. Well, I said, well, what about our roads? What about our schools? What about our fire departments, our police departments, our labor unions, Social Security, Medicare? And they just couldn't come back on it. They said, yeah, we agree with you 100%. It's that simple. That's socialism.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what they're not being told. I mean, when you would tune into Fox so-called news and you see one of these debates about, or these discussions about how, well, socialism, that word socialism was part of the word Nazi. It's the National Socialists. Therefore, socialism produces Hitler. And it's like these the people that Rick was talking about just a second ago, these uneducated, uninformed, malinformed Fox watchers and Trump voters watch that and go, oh yeah, socialism, Nazis. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She must want to be Hitler. And it is the simplest form of stupidity. It's insane. I mean, Sean, thank you. It is breathtakingly insane. And yet, literally, you will be hearing that argument being made right now, today, on Right Wing Hate Radio, all across America, and on Fox News with, virtually daily, certainly regularly. It's nuts.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And the only solution to it that I know of is to talk back to it. What our last caller did in the tire place. Good on him. I mean, that's what we all need to be doing. And welcome back. Alan in Vancouver, Canada, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Alan, are you American or Canadian?
Oh, I'm Canadian.
What do you think of your healthcare system?
For 15 years now.
Ah, well, thank you.
I'm proposing this law. I'm calling it H.R. 666. And I have to read it because it's legalese. So here goes.
If it runs over 10 or 15 seconds, I'm going to cut you off, Alan.
Well, maybe you'll like it. Pursuant to the Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, namely, Congress shall make exceptions and regulations proscribing the powers of the Supreme Court. This law shall remove from the courts the ability to endow corporations with the qualities of human beings, including but not limited to freedom of speech, right of privacy, unlimited influence on democratic institutions. Furthermore, the Supreme Court decisions, i.e. laws that gave human qualities to corporations, shall be ruled null and void. Only Congress can make such laws, period.
That's brilliant. I do like it, Alan. In fact, I'd love to see it.
I sent that to you by email on Tuesday, just after your show was over.
You did?
Maybe 12:30, 1 o'clock.
I never saw it. I have a pretty rigorous spam filter. You might try sending it again.
Well, I've only sent one.
Okay. Probably the best way, though, to get stuff to me that gets around any kind of spam filter is to tweet it to me, although this is kind of long for a Twitter. I suppose you could do it in 2 tweets.
Well, you've got it recorded now, so
yeah,
you can
there you go.
listen to your own show.
So, yeah, easier said than done. Alan, I'm curious. You're a Canadian citizen. You live just over the border, so you're familiar with the United States as well as Canada. How do most Canadians think of your Medicare for All system?
Well, nobody complains.
Seriously?
My girlfriend now is going through a lot of testing. She has a leg problem, so the X-rays and MRIs and might be a clot, and she's not worried about getting access.
Does she have to pay anything for all that?
No, not a cent.
Literally not a cent. There are no co-pays. There's no minimums.
No. And she seems to get into the doctor anytime she wants to go. She doesn't have to line up or anything.
Right. How much do you pay for it every month, if you don't mind?
Well, I'm a senior, so I don't pay anything.
But if you weren't a senior, how much does the average Canadian pay?
Gee, the last time I heard a number was $72 a month.
Per family member? Or per family?
Per member, yeah. Or
per
family group would get a slightly reduced rate. But,
And now, I'm on Medicare here in the United States, which is like your Medicare for All, but I pay a couple $100 a month to Medicare. You don't have to pay anything once you're over 65?
Yeah, once you're over 65.
Wow.
I get a bus pass for $45 a year. I can go anywhere by bus.
Wow.
All year.
Wow.
Anywhere.
So, and you've got the equivalent of Social Security in Canada too, right?
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. That's just
I don't have a mortgage, so luckily I'm able to live on my pension. No problem.
And by pension, you mean what we would call Social Security, the government funding, the government pension, as opposed to a workplace pension. Alan, thank you. Thanks for educating me, and thanks for that restricting corporate power riff. Please email it to me again. Maybe it can get through. I'd love to see it. It is coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. Just did a rant about how we have actually passed a major climate change tipping point that we can't walk back from. We can't stop it. This is coming now. It is unstoppable. This first step of it, which has to do with, the destruction of major cities in the United States and all around the world. You can check this out over at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, or for people who support us on YouTube as well, you can see this. Get over to patreon.com/THOMHARTMANN to check this out. We're talking about how prior to a couple of years ago, and this is how, tipping points, you can only see them in the rearview mirror. Prior to a couple of years ago, in the winter, the Antarctic and Greenland would recover some of their ice. Now they're not even doing that. It's just pausing. The melting is just pausing. That's that tipping point. And the consequences of this are going to be terrible. Check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. To our Patreon page. So check it out, patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. Thank you. Welcome back. River in Portland, Oregon. Hey, River, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to X-Ray FM.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks for being here. I was curious, the other day you mentioned in passing the public trust doctrine. And I was hoping that that's something you could explain to the listeners a little bit, because there was an article that was circulated during the 2016 election that talked about that doctrine and how it kind of fell out of favor in the Democratic Party as younger people came up around, like when the Clintons started appearing and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And to me, the fact that ideology has been worn away is part of why it's so easy now for Republicans to point at us and be like, oh, you're a socialist, as though that's a dirty word. Because to them that means Marxism, Mao, and Stalin, when there's actually this very reasonable foundation that used to exist in the public conversation, and now it's been wiped out. So I was just curious if you could talk more about that.
Well, by and large, I mean, we still have it. The idea is that governments are created to hold the commons, essentially. That there are these functions, these protective, essentially, functions of the public that are held in trust by the government, whether it's the fire departments or whether it's the parks. And that, we should extend this to our atmosphere, to the environment. Is the argument that you know, is being made by some? I believe it might be made in the Juliana case. The basis is the public trust doctrine. Am I speaking to what you're asking, River?
Yeah, I think so. And what I got from the thing that I read, I think it might have been an Atlantic article or something like that, was that this was also the justification for progressive and social policies where wealth is being managed responsibly, because if you're sequestering wealth, well, that's based on natural resources, and you owe it to those of us who live on this planet to help us continue to live on this planet if you're pushing that stuff around, right?
Yeah, amen. Well said. And River, the idea that it's just no longer discussed. I mean, that you're right. I haven't heard, you know, the phrase public trust in decades, and it is something that was talked about certainly in civics class when I was, you know, 8 years old, but you know, has largely fallen out of favor. So River, thank you for bringing.
You might want to.
Go ahead.
You might want to check out that article because it was interesting. It had a kind of sensationalist title called "How the Democratic Party Lost Its Populist Soul," but it had a really cool kind of micro-history of who the Democrats in office were at different stages in the 20th century and why that idea wore away. Anyway, thank you for everything. I'm going to get going.
River, if you have an opportunity to tweet that article to me, I'd love to see it. I don't know if River's still there, but thank you. Thank you for the call. George in Chicago. Hey, George, what's up? Thanks for listening to Chicago's Progressive Talk.
A couple of observations on Foxconn. First, circa 1913, the United States and Canada ratified a treaty called the Great Lakes Compact, which forbids the diversion of water out of the Great Lakes beyond the Great Lakes Basin. It's not readily apparent because the elevation is not real high, but there is a continental divide that surrounds the Great Lakes, high ground that's only 6 to 8 feet in some places and maybe higher in other places. But it's a result of the weight of the water pushing down the landscape, and then the perimeter rises. And so any rain that falls in the Great Lakes ends up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and if it falls to the south or west, it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. The point being is that the Great Lakes are slow to recharge, and so diversion of large amounts of water could compromise navigation and water supplies and a number of other things. Now, the Foxconn plant is in violation of the spirit, if not the technical language of the treaty, by virtue of the fact that it is beyond the edge of the Great Lakes Basin, but they were allowed to tie into the water supply of a community that's adjacent to Lake Michigan and to use their allotment of Lake Michigan water.
Is this, George, is this blown up by the fact that Foxconn is no longer going to build a factory there?
Well, there's what I'm saying is that all the groundwork for this was dishonest from the beginning. That they're going to violate a treaty that's been in effect for over 100 years. In addition to which, Chinese companies, and Foxconn in particular, have a bad reputation when it comes to pollution and release of toxic materials.
Yeah.
And here in the Chicago area, we've had bad experiences with cryptosporidium coming down from the Milwaukee and Wisconsin area. It's from the agricultural waste runoff from the fields, and it's very difficult for the fresh water system to purify. And so we were expecting more toxic releases if this plant got into full operation. Now, hopefully, with a Democratic governor and Democratic legislatures in the future, they can reverse this.
Yeah, hopefully. George, I got to run. Thank you for the call, and thanks for the heads up on that. I was unaware of the treaty. But it doesn't surprise me that the whole Foxconn thing was fraudulent from the get-go. It was a Scott Walker, Donald Trump project. What do you expect? Thanks so much for being with us today, and don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. We can't just sit around. Yeah, there's an election coming. It's not enough to just vote. You've got to get engaged. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.